By the early 1600s, the Atlantic had become a contested commercial corridor, a space where competing empires, expanding trade routes, and unregulated waters created the structural pressures that would soon make organized piracy not only possible, but inevitable. From the late 15th century onward, European expansion into the Americas reshaped global maritime systems with a speed and scale unprecedented in earlier centuries. The voyages initiated by Iberian monarchies did more than chart new territories. They altered the economic architecture of the Atlantic basin. Records from Spanish royal archives demonstrate the rapid establishment of colonial monopolies, particularly the convoy system known as the Flota de Indias, which by the mid-1500s transported bullion, dyes, sugar, and other high-value commodities between the Caribbean and Iberian ports. This new commercial circuit created predictable transport patterns and predictability. When concentrated in distant waters, invited forms of maritime predation long before classic piracy emerged. The geographic configuration of the Caribbean played a decisive role in these developments. Its archipelagic structure, as early cartographers mapped, included dozens of anchorages, shallow coves, and narrow passages suited for resupply and concealment. Spanish authorities recognized the strategic vulnerabilities early. Attempts to fortify locations such as Santo Domingo, 1502, San Juan, 1521, and Havana, 1553, reflected the need to regulate maritime traffic. Archaeological studies of early fortifications confirm the rapid militarization of these ports, indicating that European powers understood the Caribbean as an emerging economic frontier that required constant naval oversight. Technological changes in shipbuilding also influenced the trajectory toward later piracy. The development of larger, sturdier galleons provided Spain with effective transatlantic cargo capacity, but their size made them sluggish in close combat or shallow waters. In contrast, French and English shipwrights increasingly favored lighter, more maneuverable vessels, pinnaces, and barks that proved suited to quick assaults. According to naval treatises from the period, these ships were adaptable for both commerce and raiding, reflecting the dual civilian-military nature of Atlantic activity during the 16th century. This divergence in vessel types produced an imbalance. Treasure-bearing fleets moved slowly across predictable routes, while rival sailors possessed the means to intercept them. European conflict intensified these structural vulnerabilities. During the Italian Wars and subsequent Habsburg-Valois conflicts, French captains began striking at Spanish shipping, especially around the Antilles and the Florida coast. Contemporary French chronicles refer to these raiders as corsairs, legally sanctioned but frequently operating with minimal supervision. Their activities, intercepting merchant vessels, extracting ransoms, and sacking poorly defended ports, represented some of the earliest organized violations of Spanish colonial sovereignty. These actions were not yet piracy in the later sense, but they demonstrated how geopolitical competition produced blurred lines between state-approved warfare and independent maritime violence. English involvement followed a parallel trajectory. The Tudor crown sought access to the Atlantic economy but lacked the territorial presence Spain had secured. This disparity encouraged the issuance of letters of marque to captains such as John Hawkins and Francis Drake. According to English Admiralty records, these privateers carried both commercial cargo and armaments, conducting trade where permitted and raids where profitable. Drake's circumnavigation of 1577 to 1580, during which he seized Spanish ships along the Pacific coast, exemplified the global reach of early English privateering. His operations relied heavily on navigational intelligence, alliances with local populations, and rapid movement, patterns that would later become characteristic of Golden Age piracy. As European rivalries expanded, the Spanish response became increasingly systematized. The convoy system, formalized by the 1560s, attempted to shield treasure ships through coordinated naval protection. Yet the system struggled with logistical constraints. Seasonal weather patterns, the need for repairs, and fluctuating cargo volumes often forced galleons to depart outside optimal windows. Archival shipping manifests reveal that unescorted vessels or delayed convoys were frequent targets, especially near the Azores and Canary Islands. This structural weakness created opportunities not only for enemy privateers but also for independent raiders who operated beyond formal state oversight. Meanwhile, the Caribbean economic environment produced new incentives for unauthorized maritime activity. Plantation agriculture expanded across the region, increasing the flow of sugar, tobacco, and hides. These commodities were high in value but low in weight, making them ideal for theft and resale. Colonial port administrators regularly reported illegal trade between settlers, visiting merchants, and unlicensed seafarers. Portuguese and Dutch smugglers, in particular, facilitated clandestine exchanges that undermined Spanish monopoly regulations. These interactions formed the early infrastructure of what historians describe as the informal Atlantic economy, a system that operated parallel to official trade and provided a foundation upon which later pirate networks would build. An important interpretive insight emerges here. The post-Columbian maritime world produced economic density faster than states could regulate it. The scale of shipping, the dispersion of islands, and the limits of naval logistics combined to create persistent enforcement gaps. Early raiders did not fill a cultural void. They responded to structural imbalances within the newly formed Atlantic world. Their activities served as an unintended mechanism of redistribution in a heavily monopolized economy, challenging Iberian control while exploiting the very networks European expansion had created. Another key observation concerns the social composition of early maritime labor. European sailors during this period often operated under harsh contractual conditions, with low wages, strict discipline, and limited legal protections. Contemporary testimonies in both English and Spanish records describe desertion, mutiny, and unauthorized trading as recurrent problems. These practices indicated that seafarers were not passive participants but agents navigating the constraints of imperial systems. Their willingness to engage in illicit commerce foreshadowed the later transition from sanctioned raiding to outright piracy. By the early 1600s, then, the Atlantic had become a complex commercial corridor marked by wealth concentration, geopolitical competition, and regulatory strain. The combination of fortified ports, heavily laden treasure fleets, mobile raiding vessels, and a diverse maritime labor force established the essential preconditions for the Golden Age of Piracy. Structural forces, rather than individual motivations, defined the trajectory. Maritime violence evolved in tandem with state expansion, trade growth, and shifting naval capabilities. As European rivalries intensified, unauthorized maritime violence took on new, more organized forms, laying the groundwork for the rise of early Caribbean privateers and the first generation of recognizable pirates. Well before piracy became criminalized, European empires institutionalized maritime predation. Privateering emerged during the 16th century as a formalized system through which states authorized individuals to seize enemy vessels. This practice developed from earlier medieval precedents, but the expansion of transoceanic trade transformed it into a central instrument of imperial strategy. A privateer operated under a government-issued commission, commonly called a letter of marque, that provided legal justification for attacking ships belonging to opposing powers. Records indicate that by the mid-1500s, English, French, and Dutch authorities were issuing such commissions in significant numbers, especially during periods of conflict with Spain. The underlying logic was pragmatic. Privateers supplemented naval forces without imposing additional fiscal burdens on state treasuries. This delegation of violence demonstrates how early modern governments relied on semi-private mechanisms to project maritime power beyond their administrative reach. The Spanish Empire's dominance in the Americas made it an immediate target of this system. Treasure fleets carrying silver from Potosi and New Spain became focal points of European rivalries. According to surviving Spanish convoy records, the annual flota transported millions of pesos, creating incentives for foreign powers to disrupt the route. Privateering thus functioned as a method of economic warfare. English monarchs, in particular, recognized that their underdeveloped naval capacity limited their ability to challenge Spain directly. As a result, privateering became an attractive strategy. French and Dutch governments adopted similar policies, creating a competitive environment in which maritime violence became an expected feature of Atlantic geopolitics. Francis Drake represents one of the most studied examples of this phenomenon. His raids in the Caribbean and along the Pacific coast of the Americas during the 1570s illustrate the operational flexibility that privateers possessed. Logs from his 1577 to 1580 circumnavigation detail coordinated assaults on Spanish ports and shipping lanes, revealing that privateering operations could involve long-range planning, reconnaissance, and diplomacy with local populations. Drake's activities served the English crown by supplying intelligence on Spanish defenses and by demonstrating the vulnerability of Iberian colonial infrastructure. The interpretive significance of his career lies not in his later reputation but in the way his voyages highlight the blurred boundaries between state policy and entrepreneurial raiding. The Anglo-Spanish War, 1585 to 1604, accelerated the scale of privateering. Parliamentary petitions and Privy Council documents show that England issued hundreds of letters of marque during the conflict, effectively mobilizing a large segment of the maritime workforce for sanctioned raiding. Privateering ventures operated as joint stock enterprises, attracting investors who expected to profit from captured goods, ships, and ransom payments. This financial structure introduced an early form of corporate organization into maritime warfare. Shareholders, captains, and crews all participated in the distribution of prize money according to prearranged contracts. Such arrangements created a predictable economic incentive system, which later influenced the egalitarian division of plunder among pirate crews in the early 18th century. French corsairs, particularly those operating out of St. Malo, demonstrated a comparable degree of organization. Archival records from Brittany indicate that corsair operations during the 16th century were subject to strict legal oversight. Courts adjudicated prize claims, enforced maritime codes of conduct, and regulated crew behavior. These administrative practices institutionalized raiding as a legitimate economic sector. One interpretive insight from this period is that privateering did not merely coexist with state authority. It reinforced and extended it. By linking maritime violence to legal institutions, governments normalized predation as a tool of national policy. Dutch privateering further expanded the strategic significance of legalized raiding. During the Dutch revolt against Spain, the Waterguzen, sea beggars, attacked Iberian shipping as part of the broader struggle for independence. According to Dutch naval correspondence, these raids provided essential support for the nascent Dutch Republic by disrupting Spanish supply lines. Later, the Dutch West India Company institutionalized privateering on a corporate scale. Company charters empowered its fleets to capture enemy vessels across the Atlantic, particularly in the Caribbean and Brazil. This merging of commercial and military objectives illustrates how privateering evolved into a hybrid form of warfare. It contributed directly to the collapse of Spain's monopoly on Atlantic trade, thereby reshaping global economic patterns. Privateering also served as a training environment for seafarers. Crews developed skills in navigation, small ship maneuvering, gunnery, and boarding tactics. Muster rolls and sailors' journals reveal that many participants later joined pirate crews during the Golden Age. Their familiarity with raiding operations, prize-taking procedures, and shipboard governance created a shared occupational culture. This continuity demonstrates an important structural insight. Piracy did not appear suddenly in the early 18th century, but emerged from an established repertoire of Atlantic maritime practices. The norms of cooperation, risk-sharing, and discipline that characterized privateering formed the foundation for later pirate codes and collective decision-making systems. While privateering was legal under certain conditions, states attempted to regulate its scope. Letters of marque specified acceptable targets, geographical limits, and reporting requirements. Captains were expected to submit seized goods for official evaluation, and courts determined whether prizes were lawful. However, enforcement varied by region and political stability. In many circumstances, ambiguous documentation or weak oversight allowed privateers to exceed their mandates. Contemporary complaints filed by merchants and governors frequently accused privateers of attacking neutral vessels or violating wartime restrictions. These disputes indicate that the boundary between lawful and unlawful raiding was frequently contested, both at sea and in legal tribunals. The conclusion of major conflicts significantly affected the privateering economy. The Treaty of London in 1604, which ended the Anglo-Spanish War, required England to halt its issuance of letters of marque. As a result, numerous privateers lost their legal justification for raiding. Similar patterns occurred elsewhere. Peace agreements regularly dissolved the temporary legal frameworks that had enabled privateering. The interpretive significance of these shifts lies in their socio-economic impact. Thousands of sailors and captains, accustomed to profitable raiding, suddenly faced unemployment. Naval records and port reports confirm a marked increase in irregular maritime activity during such transitional periods. Without state sanction, many former privateers continued their practices independently, accelerating the emergence of piracy in the 17th century. The early colonial Caribbean provided a particularly conducive environment for this transformation. Spanish defenses remained uneven, and local authorities struggled to monitor extensive coastlines. Former privateers exploited these gaps, establishing temporary bases on islands such as Tortuga and Providence. Archaeological excavations on Tortuga and historical maps of the region show how geography facilitated small ship mobility and clandestine operations. This environment favored independent raiders who were no longer bound by the regulatory constraints of letters of marque. As European powers attempted to impose greater administrative order, these autonomous groups gradually evolved into the buccaneers and pirates who would dominate the subsequent century. By the early 17th century, the institutional framework that had legitimized maritime raiding was increasingly contested. As state navies expanded and diplomatic relationships stabilized, the reliance on privateering diminished. Yet the operational methods, organizational models, and cultural norms developed under this system persisted. These continuities reveal how privateering functioned as a transitional stage between medieval maritime violence and the fully criminalized piracy of the Golden Age. When peace treaties restricted privateering, thousands of former raiders found themselves without lawful employment, creating the conditions for new forms of unauthorized maritime violence. By the mid-1600s, the Caribbean's frontier environment produced a new class of sea raiders. The rise of the buccaneers between roughly 1620 and 1680 reflects the convergence of demographic instability, marginal economic systems, and contested imperial authority in the Caribbean. Initially, buccaneers were not maritime raiders but semi-independent hunters living on the western territories of Hispaniola. Contemporary French and English descriptions refer to them as boucanier or boucaniers, referencing the indigenous technique of curing meat over a wooden frame, the boucan. These populations were ethnically diverse, consisting of French, English, Dutch, and displaced sailors who had deserted merchant ships or fled collapsing colonial ventures. Their presence on Hispaniola's frontier illustrates a broader structural pattern. Weak imperial oversight created regions in which mobile, economically flexible communities could operate outside formal colonial hierarchies. Spanish authorities attempted to suppress buccaneer hunting economies during the early 17th century. According to Spanish colonial records, governors ordered cattle slaughter campaigns to deprive frontier hunters of their main resource. This policy was designed to reassert control over the island and limit foreign encroachment. However, the campaign had unintended consequences. With declining access to wild cattle, many buccaneers turned increasingly toward maritime activity, either as small-scale traders, smugglers, or coastal raiders. This transition demonstrates how economic pressure and colonial containment policies contributed to the militarization of frontier populations. By the 1630s and 1640s, the island of Tortuga emerged as a central buccaneer base. English and French settlers intermittently occupied the island, but its rugged terrain and limited resources meant that no single power could maintain firm control. Records from the Compagnie des Isles d'Amérique show that French authorities issued limited commissions to certain leaders, granting them provisional legitimacy to defend the island or attack Spanish shipping. This fragile administrative structure allowed buccaneers to operate with semi-autonomous authority. Tortuga's location, close to Hispaniola and within reach of major Spanish routes, made it a strategic staging point for raids. The shift from land-based hunting to maritime raiding required organizational changes. Buccaneer crews developed cooperative decision-making structures that later appeared among Golden Age pirates. Journals recount that crew members participated in choosing captains, planning expeditions, and distributing shares of captured goods. These systems were partly practical. Long-term operations in hostile environments required collective agreement to maintain discipline. The interpretive relevance of this development lies in how decentralized governance proved functional at sea. It challenged conventional hierarchical naval models and contributed to a distinct occupational culture that valued autonomy and shared risk. Buccaneer vessels were typically small, fast, and optimized for coastal navigation. Archaeological evidence from Caribbean wreck sites suggests that these ships carried limited artillery but relied heavily on speed, shallow draft, and boarding tactics. Operational accounts describe the use of canoes, piraguas, and light sloops capable of maneuvering in waters inaccessible to heavily armed Spanish galleons. This strategic flexibility enabled buccaneers to exploit gaps in Spanish surveillance and conduct surprise attacks along vulnerable segments of the coast. By the mid-17th century, buccaneering had shifted decisively toward organized raiding against Spanish colonies. One early example is the 1635 raid on Campeche, detailed in Spanish administrative reports, which documented the destructive capacity of relatively small buccaneer fleets. As these operations expanded, Spanish authorities attempted to improve coastal defenses and reorganize militia networks. The pattern indicates a gradual militarization of the Caribbean frontier. Decentralized raiders adapted to weaknesses in urban fortification, while Spanish administrators attempted to impose centralized protective systems. The most famous phase of buccaneering occurred between the 1660s and 1680s, led by figures such as Henry Morgan. Morgan's early career illustrates the blurred boundaries between privateering, colonial militia service, and autonomous raiding. Although often depicted in popular narratives as a pirate, archival evidence demonstrates that Morgan operated under commissions issued by the English governor of Jamaica, particularly during the Anglo-Spanish conflicts of the 1660s. These documents provided a legal foundation for his actions, although Spanish authorities consistently rejected their legitimacy. Morgan's 1668 assault on Portobello represents a key example of buccaneer operational strategy. According to eyewitness accounts and Spanish reports, the buccaneers conducted a multi-stage approach, landing north of the city, destroying outlying defenses, and advancing through fortifications before capturing the central port. The raid demonstrated the tactical benefits of flexible troop deployment, discipline among mixed nationality crews, and reconnaissance based on prior regional knowledge. Its success illustrated how buccaneers exploited weaknesses in Spanish defensive coordination. The 1671 attack on Panama City marked the height of buccaneer military capability. Morgan assembled one of the largest buccaneer coalitions recorded in the period, drawing participants from Jamaica, Tortuga, and other frontier settlements. Marching across the Isthmus of Panama, the force encountered Spanish resistance at the Battle of Matachin. Documentation from Spanish officials describes how the defenders were outmaneuvered by the buccaneers' tactical mobility. The subsequent sack of Panama demonstrated the destructive potential of semi-organized raiding forces when operating beyond direct naval oversight. Although Morgan claimed that his commission authorized the expedition, the attack technically violated the recently signed Treaty of Madrid, and the English crown briefly detained him for diplomatic reasons. The cultural impact of the buccaneers extended beyond specific raids. Buccaneer articles, informal agreements drafted before expeditions, outlined compensation for injury, division of plunder, and rules of conduct. These articles reveal stable normative expectations among crews. Their emphasis on equitable distribution and guaranteed compensation for wounds shows a rationalized labor system adapted to high-risk environments. The prevalence of these agreements suggests early codification of shipboard labor rights among raiders, which later influenced the written pirate codes of the early 18th century. Buccaneers also contributed to knowledge circulation within the Atlantic world. Accounts by figures such as Alexander Exquemelin, a former buccaneer surgeon, provided detailed descriptions of Caribbean geography, colonial defenses, and frontier communities. His 1678 publication, De American Zeeroevers, became a major source for European readers seeking information on the region. Although some descriptions were sensationalized, Many align with contemporary Spanish and French documentation. The interpretive value of Exquemelin's account lies in its depiction of the social structures that shaped buccaneer life, including fluid recruitment, shared provisions, and extensive interethnic cooperation. The decline of buccaneering began in the late 17th century as European states expanded formal colonial administration. Spain strengthened its Caribbean fortifications, while France and England sought tighter control over their frontier populations. Royal governors in Jamaica and Saint-Domingue issued edicts restricting unauthorized raiding and enhancing naval patrols. Administrative correspondence from this period records increasing pressure on buccaneer communities to settle as planters, militia members, or coastal laborers. These policies reflected a broader transition from informal frontier governance to centralized colonial regulation. Environmental factors also contributed to the decline. Overhunting and settlement expansion reduced the availability of wild cattle and pigs on Hispaniola, undermining the hunting economy that had originally supported buccaneer populations. Economic diversification, especially the rise of plantation agriculture, reduced colonial reliance on independent raiders. As economic opportunities narrowed, fewer individuals were drawn into buccaneer networks, and existing groups fragmented or migrated. By the 1680s, major buccaneer havens such as Tortuga and Port Royal were undergoing administrative transformation. French authorities imposed structured governance in Tortuga, while English officials attempted to regulate privateering in Jamaica more tightly. These shifts weakened the semi-autonomous environment that had sustained buccaneer culture. Without access to protected bases, raiders increasingly operated without state sanction, contributing to the rise of more openly criminalized piracy. As European states consolidated control in the Caribbean, buccaneering havens became targets of suppression, pushing sea raiders into more illicit patterns of activity. The vast movement of bullion and commodities created predictable maritime targets. From the early 16th century onward, the Atlantic economy developed into a structured network linking Europe, Africa, and the Americas. This system supported imperial revenue, enabled large-scale population movements, and encouraged competition among European powers. The scale and regularity of these exchanges created conditions in which maritime raiders, first privateers and later pirates, could identify, study, and exploit predictable shipping patterns. Understanding these trade networks provides essential context for why piracy later concentrated in specific regions and targeted specific cargoes. Central to early Atlantic commerce was the Spanish treasure fleet system, established in the mid-16th century to regulate the movement of bullion from the Americas. The fleets consisted of two main convoys, the flotta serving New Spain and the galleons serving Tierra Firme. Both systems were designed to synchronize shipping schedules, consolidate valuable cargoes, and provide joint naval protection. Records from the Casa de Contratación in Seville document how fleets departed annually, carrying silver from Potosi and Zacatecas, gold from New Granada, and manufactured goods destined for colonial markets. This predictable circulation of wealth created what contemporaries recognized as the richest maritime corridor in the Atlantic world. The Spanish attempt to secure these routes had notable consequences. Convoy organization reduced the vulnerability of individual ships but produced concentrated targets whenever fleets were delayed, separated by storms, or forced to shelter in Caribbean ports. According to surviving correspondence from colonial governors, weather events frequently disrupted schedules, leaving isolated galleons susceptible to interception. These patterns became widely known among rival European powers, and over time among independent raiders operating in the region. The regular presence of treasure fleets encouraged sustained maritime observation, intelligence gathering, and opportunistic violence. Parallel to bullion transport, the plantation economy reshaped Caribbean commerce from the mid-17th century onward. English, French, and Dutch colonies increasingly specialized in the production of sugar, tobacco, and later coffee and cacao. Plantations required significant capital investment, labor, and infrastructure, encouraging the growth of merchant fleets transporting goods to European markets. The scale of this commerce expanded rapidly. English customs records show substantial increases in sugar imports during the late 1600s, reflecting both rising demand and intensified exploitation of enslaved labor. These shipments were carried in relatively lightly armed merchant vessels, making them attractive to raiders seeking valuable cargoes rather than bullion alone. The integration of Africa into Atlantic exchange further increased maritime traffic. European merchants carried manufactured goods to West African ports, exchanged them for enslaved people, and transported enslaved laborers across the Middle Passage to plantation colonies. This triangular pattern, although administratively complex, created highly predictable routes. Ship captains adhered to seasonal wind systems, such as the northeast trade winds, and followed established coastal approaches to minimize risk. Pirates later exploited this predictability, particularly along the Windward Passage, the Lesser Antilles, and the approaches to the Bahamas. Dutch commercial expansion during the 17th century added further layers to Atlantic economic geography. The Dutch West India Company, WIC, established trading posts, engaged in privateering, and competed for access to Caribbean markets. The WIC's capture of the Spanish treasure fleet off Cuba in 1628, led by Piet Hein, illustrates the vulnerability of centralized bullion transport when confronted by well-coordinated maritime opposition. Dutch records emphasize the logistical planning involved in intercepting the fleet, demonstrating how knowledge of Spanish convoy practices enabled successful attacks. This event reinforced the perception across the Atlantic world that even heavily defended trade routes could be penetrated by determined raiders. As commerce expanded, so did the number of intercolonial trade routes within the Caribbean. Vessels transported provisions, livestock, timber, and manufactured goods between islands. Spanish, English, French, and Dutch settlements relied on one another for supplies, often engaging in illegal trade despite official prohibitions. These short-distance routes were less regulated than transatlantic passages and typically used smaller vessels with minimal armament. Later pirates, particularly during the Golden Age, targeted these inter-island shipments because they offered consistent opportunities for rapid acquisition of resources without the risks associated with attacking major convoys. The economic concentration of Caribbean ports shaped raiding patterns. Cities such as Havana, Cartagena, Port Royal, and Veracruz became essential nodes in imperial supply chains. Their warehouses accumulated bullion, agricultural goods, textiles, and military supplies awaiting shipment. Administrative correspondence from these ports demonstrates constant concerns about defense readiness, shortages of naval escorts, and delays in fleet departures. These vulnerabilities were compounded by varying levels of colonial investment. While Spain invested heavily in coastal fortifications such as Castillos and Felipe de Barajas in Cartagena, other ports suffered from underfunding, creating uneven layers of protection across the region. Interpretively, the structured movement of wealth across the Atlantic demonstrates how economic systems can unintentionally generate opportunities for illicit activity. First, regularity created predictable targets. Second, centralization produced points of concentrated value. Third, imperial monopolies limited legal access to trade, encouraging smuggling and undermining official enforcement. These systemic conditions help explain why piracy and privateering persisted even as empires expanded administrative control. Maritime predation operated within, rather than outside, the broader economic framework of the Atlantic. Shipping patterns also influenced the technological and organizational practices adopted by raiders. The need to intercept fast-moving merchant convoys encouraged the use of light, maneuverable vessels. The variety of commodities transported, ranging from silver to sugar to enslaved laborers, shaped raiding strategies and determined which ships were considered valuable targets. Raiders studied seasonal sailing schedules, port routines, and coastal geography, demonstrating how knowledge acquisition functioned as a critical component of maritime predation. By the late 17th century, the wealth of Atlantic commerce had reached levels that demanded increased naval protection. European states recognized that structured trade routes, while economically efficient, created strategic vulnerabilities. As a result, imperial governments initiated broader maritime security measures, organized patrols, and established administrative frameworks for suppressing unauthorized violence. Structured trade routes also enabled imperial naval responses. Imperial oversight remained thin across thousands of miles of coastline. Between 1650 and 1700, the Caribbean basin expanded into a densely trafficked maritime corridor, yet European empires lacked the institutional capacity, financial resources, and logistical infrastructure to police it effectively. Although England, France, Spain, and the Netherlands maintained permanent naval forces, these fleets were primarily organized for European conflicts rather than colonial defense. Parliamentary reports from England and administrative correspondence from Spain consistently show that imperial navies were underfunded, undersupplied, and frequently diverted to wars on the continent. As a result, vast areas of the Caribbean operated as frontier zones in which unauthorized maritime activity could flourish. The Spanish Empire faced the most acute challenges. Its Caribbean holdings stretched across Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and coastal enclaves in Mexico and Colombia. Spanish records from the Consejo de Indias emphasize chronic shortages of ships, ammunition, and crews. The maintenance of the treasure fleet consumed much of Spain's available naval resources, leaving few vessels for continuous patrol work. Spanish galleons were designed primarily for transoceanic transport, not for rapid pursuit of small raiding craft. Surviving fleet logs indicate that escort vessels were often older, slower ships that lacked the maneuverability needed to counter buccaneers or early pirates operating in shallow coastal waters. England and France possessed greater naval potential, but their priorities lay elsewhere. The English Navy during the mid-17th century was preoccupied with conflicts such as the Anglo-Dutch Wars, which consumed resources and required prolonged deployments in European waters. Colonial correspondence from Jamaica regularly reported that local governors petitioned the Crown for additional naval protection, often without success. The logistical cost of maintaining warships across the Atlantic was substantial. Ships needed periodic careening, fresh timber, and reliable supply chains, none of which were consistently available in Caribbean ports. French naval power in the region was similarly constrained. Although France expanded its Caribbean territories during the mid-17th century, administrative reports from Saint-Domingue show that naval detachments were small and irregular. The French crown prioritized its Mediterranean and Atlantic coasts, leaving colonial governors to rely on a mix of locally hired vessels and occasional support from the Marine Royale. Many French settlements depended more on militia forces and privateering commissions than on official naval patrols. This reliance indicates a structural weakness. Colonial defense was decentralized and inconsistent, creating gaps in oversight that persistent sea raiders could exploit. The geographic complexity of the Caribbean further limited imperial enforcement. The region contains hundreds of islands, narrow channels, reefs, and shallow banks. Surveying such territory required substantial cartographic knowledge and continuous patrols. Yet charts remained incomplete through much of the 17th century. Spanish and English navigational manuals from the period frequently referenced uncharted shoals or uncertain harbor depths. Buccaneers and independent mariners, however, accumulated practical local knowledge through long-term residence, hunting expeditions, and inter-island travel. This asymmetry gave raiders a significant operational advantage. They could navigate lesser-known passages, evade large warships, and approach targets undetected. In addition to geographic obstacles, administrative fragmentation weakened imperial authority. Caribbean colonies operated with varying degrees of autonomy, each reporting to different metropolitan institutions. English colonies corresponded with the Board of Trade. Spanish colonies reported to the Casa de Contratación and Consejo de Indias. French colonies communicated with the Ministère de la Marine. These administrative divides slowed decision-making and complicated coordination. Naval deployments required financial authorization, supply allocation, and intercolonial communication, all of which faced bureaucratic delays. Pirates could exploit the lag between reported incidents and official response, knowing that punitive expeditions often took months to organize. Resource shortages also limited maritime enforcement. Ships required specialized crews, and European navies routinely suffered from labor deficits. Press records and naval recruitment records demonstrate that wars in Europe created high demand for sailors, reducing the pool available for colonial service. Caribbean governors frequently noted that sailors stationed in the region deserted in search of higher wages or more stable employment in merchant shipping. Without reliable manpower, Caribbean patrols were intermittent and often symbolic rather than effective deterrents. Interpretively, these naval limitations underscore how imperial power in the Caribbean was more nominal than operational. Deploying authority across long distances required sustained investment, administrative cohesion, and maritime infrastructure, conditions Europe had not yet fully developed. The Caribbean operated as a gray zone, where the reach of imperial sovereignty weakened outside fortified ports. Frontier areas such as the Bahamas, Tortuga, and parts of the Lesser Antilles existed at the periphery of imperial attention. These zones offered anchorage, access to fresh water, and concealment, enabling sea raiders to resupply and repair ships beyond the surveillance of official navies. Another factor contributing to weak enforcement was the difficulty of distinguishing between legitimate commerce, privateering, and piracy. Privateering commissions were widely issued during European wars, creating ambiguous legal positions for many mariners. English and French captains sometimes continued raiding after their commissions expired or after treaties rendered their activities illegal. Local governors occasionally tolerated or tacitly encouraged such behavior, particularly when raiding produced economic benefits for colonial settlements. This blurred line between lawful and unlawful maritime violence complicated naval efforts to suppress piracy. Imperial fleets lacked both the resources and the political clarity needed to police ambiguous activities. The environmental conditions of the Caribbean added operational strain. Hurricanes, tropical storms, and sudden weather shifts damaged ships and disrupted patrol schedules. Naval logs frequently mention vessels forced back to port due to storm damage. Pirates, who tended to operate in smaller vessels, could shelter in coves or shallow harbors inaccessible to larger warships. These environmental asymmetries further limited the effectiveness of official naval patrols. By the late 17th century, European powers recognized these limitations but struggled to overcome them. Expanding naval presence required significant investment, shipbuilding capacity, and stable colonial revenues. While some reforms were attempted, such as England's establishment of more permanent squadrons in the Jamaica station, the measures were insufficient to control the entire region. Instead, the Caribbean remained a patchwork of heavily monitored ports and loosely governed maritime frontiers. These gaps made it possible for former privateers to shift into outright piracy. This section examines the maritime labor environment of the 17th and early 18th centuries, emphasizing the structural pressures that shaped seafaring populations. Naval and merchant service operated under rigid hierarchies, harsh discipline, and chronically delayed or inadequate pay. Wartime mobilization, particularly during the Anglo-Dutch Wars and the 9 Years' War, expanded the demand for sailors, but peace treaties brought sudden demobilization, leaving thousands of mariners unemployed. The mobility of labor within the Atlantic world meant that sailors often shifted between naval vessels, merchantmen, privateers, and colonial ports, creating a fluid workforce with limited long-term security. Economic volatility, dangerous working conditions, and restricted legal recourse reinforced widespread dissatisfaction among crews. These circumstances made piracy appear to some mariners as a comparatively autonomous, participatory, and economically rewarding alternative system. This analysis highlights that piracy did not emerge from cultural deviance alone, but from structural stresses embedded in Atlantic labor markets and seafaring life. For many mariners, piracy represented an alternative economic system, appeals to viewers seeking structural socio-economic explanations. These pressures catalyzed the emergence of the first major pirate wave. This section analyzes the emergence of Anglo-Caribbean piracy between the 1650s and 1660s, a period shaped by the conclusion of several major conflicts, including the Anglo-Spanish War and Cromwell's Western Design. As peace treaties curtailed privateering commissions, many English and colonial mariners, accustomed to raiding Spanish shipping under state sanction, found themselves without lawful means of employment. The transition from privateering to piracy was gradual rather than abrupt. Crews retained their organizational structures, operational methods, and targets, but continued their activities without official authorization. Colonial ports such as Jamaica and Barbados provided markets, provisions, and tacit support, enabling these groups to sustain raiding operations despite imperial prohibitions. Anglo-Caribbean pirates also benefited from regional instability. Spanish defenses remained uneven, while English governors oscillated between prosecution and quiet tolerance depending on political circumstances. This period established the foundations of later pirate behavior, including shared plunder systems, shipboard governance customs, and the targeting of lightly defended merchant routes. The rise of these early Anglo-Caribbean pirates demonstrates how illicit maritime violence evolved directly from state-sponsored conflict, becoming an increasingly autonomous force within the wider Atlantic world. When wartime commissions ended, many crews continued their operations illegally. Shows early transition from sanction to illegal violence. Increasing pressure forced pirates to seek new bases. Spanish America remained the primary target of illicit raiding. The early Anglo-Caribbean pirates of the mid-17th century directed the bulk of their operations toward regions long recognized for their wealth and limited defensive capacity. Records from colonial administrations indicate that merchant routes linking Veracruz, Cartagena, Portobello, and Havana were among the busiest in the Atlantic system, carrying silver, dyestuffs, and agricultural goods towards Spain. These convoys, while theoretically protected by the flota structure, often left significant gaps during departure and arrival windows. Pirates exploited these intervals, positioning themselves near predictable channels where coastal pilots guided vessels through shallow waters. The resulting pattern of interception demonstrates that early raiders relied on localized knowledge rather than long-distance pursuit, an operational method inherited from privateering tradition. One of the earliest well-recorded examples is the assault on Campeche. English and colonial mariners targeted the port repeatedly during the 1650s, recognizing its role as a regional timber hub with modest fortifications. Spanish correspondence from Yucatan reflects sustained concern over these attacks, noting that raiders typically approached in small, shallow draft vessels capable of landing directly on unguarded beaches. The emphasis on mobility rather than firepower allowed these groups to overwhelm temporary militias before retreating with provisions, goods, or hostages. This pattern highlights an early interpretive insight. Piracy during this period operated less as indiscriminate violence and more as opportunistic extraction, shaped by local geography and the uneven development of colonial defenses. Farther east, the raids on Maracaibo during the 1660s underscore how loosely coordinated groups of Anglo-Caribbean pirates exploited internal weaknesses in Spanish America. Maracaibo's lagoon system required complex navigation through narrow channels, which Spanish administrators assumed would deter large-scale assault. Yet according to officials' reports, raiders adapted quickly, employing captured pilots or conducting reconnaissance to learn the routes. Once inside the lagoon, they launched sequential attacks on coastal settlements and shipping, withdrawing before Spanish reinforcements could mobilize from Caracas or Cartagena. Archaeological surveys around the region have since uncovered remnants of hastily fortified earthworks, supporting textual claims that communities attempted to reinforce defenses only after repeated incursions. These operations also reveal an emerging shift in pirate behavior. Earlier raiders typically avoided extended occupations, focusing on quick strikes. However, during the Maracaibo campaigns, several crews remained in the lagoon for multiple weeks, seizing vessels, gathering supplies, and negotiating ransoms. This suggests an experimental phase in which pirates probed the limits of Spanish response capacity. When local governors struggled to mount effective countermeasures, raiders grew increasingly confident in their ability to operate within territorial waters rather than solely at sea. This transition marks an important interpretive insight. The evolution from single-event attacks to sustained campaigns illustrates how weak administrative oversight could transform piracy into a semi-structured activity. The continued targeting of Spanish shipping stemmed in part from the asymmetric distribution of wealth in the Americas. Silver extracted from Potosi and transported overland to Portobello, then onward to Cartagena and Havana, remained the most lucrative commodity flow in the Atlantic. Spanish treasure fleets attempted to mitigate risk through convoying, but auxiliary shipments, including locally traded cacao, hides, and indigo, traveled independently or with minimal escort. Early pirates recognized that these secondary goods offered consistent profit with substantially lower risk. As a result, many crews concentrated on raiding smuggling routes and intercolonial traffic rather than attempting to intercept the heavily defended flottas. This demonstrates how piracy functioned as an adaptive economic practice, responding to structural vulnerabilities rather than pursuing only high-value prizes. Coastal towns also remained vulnerable due to demographic and logistical constraints. Spanish America's population centers were scattered across vast territories, stretching administrative resources thin. Muster rolls and military audits from the 17th century show that garrisons in many settlements operated far below official quotas, with shortages of powder, artillery, and seaworthy vessels. Pirates exploited these deficiencies by attacking sites with predictable supply needs. For example, English raiders struck towns during religious festivals or harvest seasons, when local militias were occupied or dispersed. Spanish chroniclers repeatedly noted that these assaults targeted warehouses, coastal ranches, and lightly guarded customs houses rather than major fortifications, further indicating a strategic assessment by pirate crews of cost versus benefit. Not all raids succeeded. Imperial regulations tightened after each major incident, leading to periodic improvements in coastal surveillance. In some regions, reconstructed fortifications and increased naval patrols forced pirates into less favorable waters. The enhanced defenses of Veracruz and Cartagena during the late 17th century illustrate this trend. Spanish engineers expanded coastal batteries, reorganized militia structures, and increased the use of lookout posts to monitor approaching vessels. These developments yielded measurable results. Interception records from the 1670s show a decline in successful large-scale raids on well-defended ports. Consequently, pirates shifted toward smaller settlements or redirected efforts toward shipping lanes with minimal military presence. By the late 1670s, this tactical evolution became evident across the Caribbean. Pirates increasingly relied on speed and surprise, avoiding prolonged occupations that risked engagement with strengthened Spanish forces. The enhanced fortification of coastal towns also contributed to the rise of mid-ocean targeting, where merchant vessels lacked immediate support. This change in strategy reveals a clear cause-effect pattern. As Spain reinforced its coastal defenses, raiders adapted by dispersing their operations and pursuing more flexible, sea-based tactics. As Spain strengthened defenses, pirate strategies shifted, pursuing more flexible, sea-based tactics. As Spain strengthened defenses, pirate strategies shifted. You said, Section 3, Decline of Buccaneering and Imperial Crackdowns, approximate 700 words, summary. Describes the Treaty of Madrid, 1670, suppression of Tortuga, and the fall of Port Royal, 1692. Hook. By the late 1600s, buccaneering became increasingly untenable. Target audience insight provides clarity on why the first wave ended. Logical transition. These suppressions set the stage for the far more famous second wave. ChatGPT said, "Here is Chapter 3, Section 3 in your required academic documentary style, almost equals 700 words, with no heading, matching tone, structure, and pacing." By the late 1600s, buccaneering became increasingly untenable. The structural decline of buccaneering emerged from shifts in imperial policy, expanded naval coordination, and the consolidation of colonial governance across the Caribbean. The Treaty of Madrid in 1670 marked a decisive moment in Anglo-Spanish relations. For the first time, England formally recognized Spanish territorial claims in the Americas, and in return Spain acknowledged England's control over Jamaica. The agreement required both kingdoms to restrict unauthorized maritime aggression. English governors received explicit instructions to discontinue the issuing of commissions that had long provided a legal framework for raiding. This change removed the political ambiguity that previously blurred the line between privateering and piracy. The treaty's language, preserved in diplomatic correspondence, makes clear that raiding Spanish possessions under any pretext was now prohibited, eliminating the institutional support that buccaneers had relied upon for decades. The suppression of Tortuga further accelerated the decline. Throughout the mid-17th century, Tortuga had operated as a semi-autonomous base drawing French, English, and Dutch adventurers engaged in hunting, trading, and maritime raiding. However, French colonial authorities under Bertrand d'Ogeron increasingly viewed the island's buccaneer population as an impediment to long-term settlement and agricultural expansion. French records indicate a deliberate policy shift toward plantation development, which required more secure conditions than buccaneering activity allowed. As governors imposed tighter oversight, restricting the sale of captured goods and enforcing new residency regulations, many buccaneers found their operations constrained. These administrative pressures reduced the island's function as a transnational raiding hub and signaled the broader imperial move toward regulated, plantation-based economies. A parallel process unfolded in Jamaica. Port Royal, often described in contemporary reports as the largest English port in the Americas, had served as a critical logistical center for buccaneers throughout the 1660s and early 1670s. Its merchants profited from the resale of captured cargoes, and its courts frequently legitimized questionable prizes. Yet following the Treaty of Madrid, English authorities sought to distance themselves from illicit maritime activity. Governors such as Sir Thomas Lynch initiated legal reforms to curtail unauthorized raiding, including stricter prize court procedures and increased surveillance of incoming vessels. These measures did not immediately eliminate buccaneering, but they limited its ability to integrate into legitimate commercial networks. The reduced availability of protected markets marked a significant economic constraint on raider operations. The 1692 earthquake that destroyed much of Port Royal compounded these administrative changes. Archaeological excavations have revealed submerged building foundations and street grids, confirming accounts that large sections of the town collapsed into the harbor within minutes. The disaster devastated the commercial infrastructure that had supported buccaneer logistics, warehouses, taverns, shipyards, and merchant houses. While the English relocated administrative functions to Kingston, the new settlement pursued a more regulated maritime economy, and officials demonstrated less tolerance for raiding than their predecessors. The loss of Port Royal's permissive environment removed one of the last major footholds for buccaneers in the Western Caribbean. Imperial naval policy also shifted during this period. Spain, France, and England expanded coastal defenses and increased patrols in contested waters. Muster rolls from Cartagena, Havana, and Santo Domingo show rising numbers of artillery pieces and garrison troops, while English naval dispatches record efforts to station more vessels in Jamaica and the Leeward Islands. These actions reduced the operational space that buccaneers had previously exploited. In regions where buccaneers once moved with limited interference, such as the Gulf of Honduras or the Windward Passage, improved surveillance made prolonged raiding campaigns substantially riskier. This demonstrates an important interpretive insight. The decline of buccaneering resulted not solely from economic hardship or treaty obligations, but from coordinated imperial strategies that decreased opportunities for unsanctioned operations. Legal changes further reinforced this pressure. The criminalization of activities previously tolerated under the guise of privateering meant that buccaneers increasingly faced prosecution rather than negotiation. Judicial records from Barbados, Jamaica, and Tortuga document escalating trials for piracy during the final decades of the 17th century. With fewer governors willing to shelter raiders and much less ambiguity regarding lawful commissions, many groups fragmented or dispersed. Some individuals retired into colonial society, others shifted into smuggling or inter-island trade, and a number eventually joined the emerging pirate communities that formed in the late 1690s. By the end of the 1680s, the buccaneering model, dependent on frontier conditions, weak state control, and fluid legal boundaries, had been largely undermined. Treaty restrictions, enhanced fortifications, and the collapse of key havens collectively signaled the end of the first pirate wave. These suppressions set the stage for the far more famous Second Wave. This section examines the aftermath of the 9 Years' War, 1688 to 1697, when European naval demobilization created unprecedented labor instability across the Atlantic. During the conflict, England, France, and the Dutch Republic expanded their fleets rapidly, drawing tens of thousands of sailors into service. Muster rolls and admiralty records show a dramatic wartime increase in shipbuilding, manning levels, and privateering commissions. When the Treaty of Ryswick ended hostilities in 1697, these vessels were retired or placed in reserve, and maritime labor demand dropped sharply. Demobilization outpaced civilian economic absorption, leaving a surplus of skilled seafarers in port cities such as Portsmouth, Amsterdam, and La Rochelle. Wages fell, merchant contracts became intermittent, and conditions aboard naval vessels, marked by strict discipline, corporal punishment, and delayed pay arrears, discouraged many sailors from re-enlisting. Former privateers, suddenly without state commissions, faced limited legal opportunities in an already strained market. This environment made illicit raiding an appealing alternative for some mariners. By situating piracy within these structural labor cycles, this section demonstrates that the early phase of the Golden Age emerged not as a spontaneous criminal surge but as a predictable outcome of geopolitical downturns. Hook. The end of the 9 Years' War returned thousands of sailors to a job market unable to absorb them. The conclusion of the 9 Years' War produced one of the most abrupt contractions in naval employment of the 17th century. England alone reduced its wartime fleet from more than 120 active ships to fewer than 60. Admiralty lists show a corresponding decline in personnel, with tens of thousands of sailors formally discharged between late 1697 and early 1699. Similar patterns unfolded in France and the Dutch Republic, where fiscal constraints required the immediate decommissioning of vessels. For individuals who had spent nearly a decade at sea under wartime conditions, this reduction generated sudden unemployment with few alternatives. Port cities recorded surges of job-seeking sailors, many of whom remained idle for extended periods due to the limited capacity of merchant firms. Merchant shipping was unable to absorb this influx. Although Atlantic commerce expanded over the long term, short-term fluctuations in freight demand limited hiring opportunities. Contracts offered by private merchants were typically seasonal, dependent on crop cycles, convoy departures, and intercolonial markets. Surviving wage records from English and Dutch firms reveal a decline in daily pay rates during the years immediately following the Treaty of Ryswick. This suggests that the supply of labor exceeded demand, weakening the bargaining power of sailors and reducing the likelihood of securing consistent employment. Economic downturns in the French Caribbean further constrained opportunities, as declining sugar prices restricted the number of vessels dispatched to Europe during these years. Labor dissatisfaction was compounded by working conditions within naval service. Naval discipline in this period relied heavily on corporal punishment, strict command hierarchies, and close regulation of crew conduct. Courts-martial records from the 1690s document frequent cases of desertion, insubordination, and disputes over unpaid wages. Mariners who had served under comparatively flexible privateering conditions during the war often resisted returning to the rigid control of naval officers. Delays in receiving prize money also weakened incentives for re-enlistment. Many discharged sailors left the fleet still owed months of pay, further eroding confidence in state employment. Privateering, which had offered substantial opportunities during the war, likewise contracted sharply. With peace restored, governments ceased issuing letters of marque, eliminating the legal framework that had allowed thousands of mariners to operate as state-sanctioned raiders. Captured vessels could no longer be sold through admiralty courts, nor could crews claim shares under the prize laws that had governed wartime maritime predation. Individuals who had relied on privateering for income found themselves without a lawful maritime role. Some shifted temporarily to merchant service, while others attempted seasonal fishing or coastal transport. Yet a significant number retained their wartime vessels or acquired new ones through informal networks, continuing raiding practices in violation of peacetime treaties. This transitional moment provided several interpretive insights. First, the conditions following the 9 Years' War demonstrate how piracy often expanded in direct proportion to post-war unemployment. The rise in illicit activity was not solely a cultural or moral phenomenon but a structural response to labor market saturation. Second, wartime training inadvertently increased the capacity for organized piracy. Sailors discharged from the fleet possessed refined navigational skills, familiarity with boarding tactics, and experience operating within complex maritime hierarchies. These competencies translated easily into raiding operations. Third, the absence of sustained naval oversight during the demobilization period created temporary geographic openings. European fleets, reduced by fiscal necessity, could not patrol the Caribbean or the Indian Ocean with the density required to enforce anti-piracy measures. In this environment, some mariners turned toward regions where imperial presence remained limited. Scattered accounts indicate increased movement into the Bahamas, Madagascar, and along the Carolina coast areas that offered both strategic distance and limited administrative scrutiny. These shifts reflected not opportunistic improvisation, but rational adaptation to economic conditions and geographic constraints. These unemployed seafarers soon moved toward new maritime zones that offered safer distances from European naval oversight. By the 1690s, a new pirate frontier emerged thousands of miles from the Caribbean. The movement of sea raiders toward Madagascar and the wider Western Indian Ocean represented a major geographic shift in the early phase of the Golden Age. This development was driven by structural pressures in the Atlantic, post-war demobilization, reduced privateering commissions, and tighter imperial control, as well as new opportunities presented by the trade routes connecting East Africa, the Red Sea, India, and the Indonesian archipelago. Madagascar, with its extensive coastline, freshwater sources, and sheltered anchorages, became a critical base for mariners seeking distance from European naval oversight. Adjacent islands such as Île Sainte-Marie, Mauritius, and Réunion complemented this frontier network, providing provisioning points, informal markets, and occasional support from transient merchant vessels. The region's capacity to sustain extended voyages made it an attractive alternative to the increasingly regulated Caribbean. The geography of Madagascar was central to its appeal. Its bays and inlets, especially those along the northeastern coast, offered secure anchorages suitable for careening, ship repair, and resupply. Hydrographic surveys undertaken by later French expeditions confirmed the presence of deep, sheltered waters along stretches of Île Sainte-Marie, which pirates favored for performing hull maintenance. Freshwater streams and accessible coastal settlements allowed crews to replenish supplies without relying on European ports. The island's relative isolation, combined with its position near major trade routes connecting the Red Sea to the Indian subcontinent, placed pirates within reach of lucrative shipping without the constant risk of interception by imperial navies. Evidence from ship logs and travel accounts indicates regular pirate movement through these waters after 1690. Records associated with captains such as Thomas Tew, Henry Every, and Richard Glover describe the use of Madagascar as a staging point for raids into the Arabian Sea. These documents detail encounters with local communities and note the availability of foodstuffs such as rice, livestock, and tropical fruits, which were vital for maintaining crews during long-distance voyages. Indigenous leaders engaged in trade with the newcomers, exchanging provisions, slaves, and occasionally political protection in return for firearms, textiles, and captured goods. This interaction created a semi-formal economy in which pirates integrated into existing regional markets while retaining autonomy from European authorities. The trade networks that developed around Madagascar were facilitated by intermediaries such as Adam Baldridge, an Englishman who established a fortified settlement on Île Sainte-Marie in the late 1690s. Colonial correspondence from New York and London references Baldridge's activities, noting that he maintained regular contact with Atlantic merchants and facilitated transactions involving seized cargo. His settlement offered warehousing, interpreters, and a degree of administrative coordination, enabling pirates to dispose of valuable commodities, including spices, textiles, and precious metals, acquired from Indian Ocean shipping. Baldridge's role illustrates how logistical infrastructure, rather than improvised anchorage alone, contributed to the region's importance as a pirate base. These developments can be understood through several interpretive insights. First, Madagascar's rise as a pirate hub demonstrates how frontier zones emerged where imperial oversight was fragmented or inconsistent. The Western Indian Ocean, divided among competing Dutch, Omani, Portuguese, and local powers, lacked the concentrated naval presence seen in the Atlantic. Second, the movement of pirates into this space illustrates the global integration of maritime labor. Sailors displaced from European navies adapted quickly to new regions, showing a high degree of geographic mobility and operational flexibility. Third, the establishment of semi-permanent settlements indicates that pirate activity in this period was not purely opportunistic. It relied on predictable resource bases and evolving commercial arrangements. The writings attributed to Captain William Kidd offer additional context. Kidd's journals and trial documents mention encounters near Madagascar, describing interactions with both pirates and local rulers. Although Kidd's own activities became the subject of political controversy, his reports confirm the presence of a functioning pirate infrastructure, including safe harbors, established trade brokers, and a steady flow of crews arriving from the Atlantic. Colonial reports from the English East India Company further corroborate these observations, warning that the concentration of raiders in the region threatened commerce between India, the Persian Gulf, and the Red Sea. By the late 1690s, Madagascar and its neighboring islands had become vital components of a transoceanic raiding network. Pirates used the region not only as a refuge but as a strategic platform for accessing the wealthiest maritime corridor of the early modern world. Their presence reshaped local economies, altered patterns of Indian Ocean commerce, and contributed to growing concerns among European and Asian trading powers regarding maritime security. From these bases, ambitious captains pursued the richest target in the early modern world: the Indian Ocean merchant convoys. Indian Ocean piracy escalated into an international crisis when raiders targeted Mughal convoys. Between 1695 and 1705, the Red Sea and Western Indian Ocean became the focus of some of the most audacious pirate operations of the early modern world. These waters carried the annual Mughal pilgrim fleets, Arabian merchants, and East India Company shipping routes loaded with high-value goods, lightly armed vessels, and predictable seasonal movements tied to the monsoon. The combination created an irresistible target for captains willing to sail far beyond the Caribbean in search of immense profit. The most notorious example came in 1695, when Henry Every and his crew intercepted and captured the Ganj-i-Sawai, a massive Mughal treasure ship returning from Mecca. The attack unleashed a diplomatic firestorm. The Mughal Empire threatened to shut down English trading factories. The East India Company scrambled to distance itself, and European governments faced pressure to demonstrate control over their own seamen. In the aftermath, multinational efforts were launched to arrest and prosecute the raiders, marking one of the earliest coordinated attempts to suppress piracy on a global scale. These Red Sea raids revealed the economic logic behind long-distance expeditions. Captains calculated that a single successful strike on a treasure fleet outweighed months of risk on the open sea. They also understood that this region's defense systems were less robust than Spanish America's fortified ports. As more pirates recognized this imbalance, the Indian Ocean became a magnet for ambitious crews seeking unprecedented plunder. The success of these attacks encouraged captains to pursue more ambitious, long-distance expeditions. This section examines the immediate post-war context following the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713, which concluded the War of the Spanish Succession. The cessation of hostilities led to the largest maritime demobilization of the early 18th century, with tens of thousands of sailors and privateers discharged across England, France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic. Naval and merchant fleets contracted sharply, leaving a surplus of highly skilled seafarers unable to find lawful employment. Contemporary admiralty records, payroll documents, and merchant correspondence indicate widespread reductions in pay, long delays in wage settlement, and limited availability of private commissions. These structural pressures, combined with harsh naval discipline and irregular merchant opportunities, created an environment in which piracy became an attractive alternative. Former privateers retained operational knowledge, shipboard governance practices, and access to vessels, enabling rapid organization into autonomous raiding crews. The convergence of labor displacement, geographic opportunity in Caribbean and Atlantic frontier zones, and declining state enforcement contributed directly to the most concentrated surge of piracy in Atlantic history. This section situates the height of the Golden Age within systemic economic and labor dynamics, demonstrating piracy as an outcome of structural maritime conditions rather than random criminal behavior. The end of the War of the Spanish Succession produced the largest maritime labor displacement of the early 18th century. The Treaty of Utrecht in 1713 ended nearly 2 decades of continental and colonial warfare that had drawn heavily on European naval manpower. England, for example, had maintained a fleet exceeding 200 vessels at the height of the conflict, including ships of the line, frigates, and auxiliary privateers commissioned for Atlantic and Caribbean operations. Muster rolls and Admiralty pay books indicate that tens of thousands of sailors were formally discharged between 1713 and 1715, with many receiving only partial settlement of their wartime wages. France and the Dutch Republic enacted similar demobilizations, leaving comparable numbers of trained sailors idle in major ports such as Brest, Rotterdam, and Amsterdam. This sudden labor surplus created acute competition for merchant employment, which could not absorb the scale of available manpower. Merchant shipping, though expanding after the war, offered insufficient compensation or stability to attract the most experienced seamen. Contract records from London, Bristol, and Liverpool indicate that voyage durations were shortened, wages decreased, and crews often faced delayed or irregular payment. Maritime historians have noted that these conditions disproportionately affected former privateers and naval veterans accustomed to both prize shares and the relative autonomy of raiding commissions. The decline in legal opportunities for profitable employment contributed to a rational calculation. Operating independently as a pirate often offered higher expected returns than merchant or navy service, despite increased risk. Structural factors compounded these labor pressures. The rigid hierarchy and severe discipline of naval service remained a deterrent. Courts-martial documents from English and French vessels detail frequent desertion and mutiny attempts, reflecting widespread dissatisfaction. Crew petitions and Admiralty correspondence reveal that corporal punishment, long working hours, and delayed wages reduced morale and lowered incentives for reenlistment. Many sailors, having experienced the flexibility of privateering or informal raiding during wartime, resisted returning to regimented command structures. Former captains, quartermasters, and skilled navigators possessed the operational knowledge necessary to form autonomous crews capable of coordinated piracy, facilitating rapid mobilization once employment opportunities failed to materialize. Geography and political gaps further enabled the rise of piracy. Frontier ports such as Nassau in the Bahamas, Charleston in South Carolina, and Port Royal in Jamaica offered relative proximity to major shipping lanes while remaining distant from centralized naval enforcement. Letters from colonial governors during the early 1710s emphasized the limited reach of metropolitan naval authority, noting that small vessels could operate along coasts and across archipelagos with minimal risk of interception. This structural gray zone created a spatial opportunity for unemployed sailors to consolidate into roving bands, operate semi-permanently from safe havens, and exploit maritime trade networks across the Caribbean and Atlantic. Economic incentives reinforced these geographic and structural factors. Atlantic commerce in this period remained highly concentrated, with treasure-laden convoys, plantation exports, and trade in enslaved peoples generating predictable patterns of movement. Ship logs, insurance records, and colonial customs documents indicate that merchants concentrated valuable cargo on specific routes during seasonal windows. Pirates, leveraging knowledge gained from privateering and merchant service, timed attacks to coincide with these predictable movements. The operational logic combined opportunity, risk management, and the concentration of skilled labor into self-organized crews, producing the surge in coordinated attacks that characterized the peak years of the Golden Age. Interpretive analysis of this period yields several key insights. First, piracy during the early 1710s represents a structural outcome of labor displacement, rather than mere opportunism or moral deviation. Demobilized sailors, denied legitimate avenues for remuneration, leveraged their skills to establish profitable, albeit illegal, operations. Second, The interplay of geographic opportunity and weak enforcement demonstrates how state absence facilitated autonomous maritime networks. The combination of accessible frontier ports, sheltered anchorages, and distant convoys created conditions where small, mobile raiding units could operate effectively. Third, the continuity of knowledge transfer between privateering, naval service, and piracy ensured that raiding techniques, command structures, and shipboard governance were sophisticated and resilient, contributing to the unprecedented concentration and success of pirate activity during this period. The immediate human consequences of post-war demobilization were thus global and systemic. Sailors displaced from European fleets quickly coalesced in strategic maritime zones, exploiting both economic necessity and opportunity. Colonial correspondence from the Caribbean and Atlantic littoral consistently reports the arrival of skilled, well-armed crews, indicating a rapid reorganization of maritime labor into autonomous pirate communities. The structural causes of this labor mobilization were compounded by continuing gaps in naval enforcement and uneven international coordination, which prevented rapid suppression of emerging pirate networks. By 1714 to 1715, these factors converged to produce the conditions for the most concentrated and sustained surge of piracy in Atlantic history. High unemployment, geographic opportunity, and the redistribution of trained seafarers set the stage for the rise of new pirate leaders, whose operations would dominate both the Caribbean and the wider Atlantic over the following decade. This environment set the stage for the rise of new pirate leaders. Nassau emerged as the central operational hub of the Golden Age. By the early 1710s, the town of Nassau on New Providence Island had evolved into a semi-autonomous pirate stronghold, providing infrastructure, shelter, and economic opportunity for the growing maritime insurgency. Its geographic location, situated near major Caribbean shipping lanes, with access to sheltered harbors and shallow coastal waters, enabled raiders to stage attacks, careen vessels, and resupply with minimal interference from imperial navies. Colonial records and contemporary travel accounts describe a loosely organized community in which pirates coordinated operations, negotiated with merchants, and maintained an informal economy based on plunder, provisions, and barter. Nassau functioned not merely as a hideout but as a functioning center of maritime commerce adapted to the specific requirements of autonomous pirate activity. The formation of the so-called Republic of Pirates reflected both necessity and innovation. Pirates arriving in Nassau encountered a regulatory vacuum. English colonial authorities were minimal, distracted by post-war fiscal and administrative pressures, and often unwilling or unable to enforce metropolitan directives consistently. This absence of oversight created conditions for a self-regulating society, where captains, quartermasters, and crews collectively determined operational norms. Contemporary letters and court testimonies from 1715 to 1718 indicate that decisions regarding prize distribution, dispute resolution, and strategic coordination were frequently made through consensus-based assemblies. These mechanisms represented a pragmatic adaptation to conditions of labor mobility and high-risk maritime operations, ensuring cohesion among crews who might otherwise act opportunistically or competitively. Economic networks within Nassau were both extensive and specialized. Merchants, innkeepers, and traders operated semi-legally, facilitating the resale of plundered goods, supplying food and water, and occasionally arranging credit for ship repairs or outfitting. Evidence from port records and colonial correspondence reveals that Nassau's population included European, African, and Creole residents who participated in provisioning, trade brokering, and intelligence gathering. Pirates leveraged these networks to sustain extended operations in the Caribbean, avoiding direct reliance on distant colonial capitals. The symbiosis between pirate crews and local commercial actors illustrates an important structural insight. Autonomous maritime communities depended on semi-formalized economic arrangements that integrated illicit and legal commerce. Nassau's operational governance extended beyond economic coordination. Historical accounts from depositions and trial records indicate the presence of formalized codes regulating conduct, compensation, and leadership succession aboard pirate vessels. While enforcement was decentralized, the consistent application of agreed-upon rules ensured predictability in interactions between crews, minimizing conflict and reducing attrition. Analysts note that the establishment of these norms, particularly the distribution of shares, decision-making processes, and accountability mechanisms, reflected a continuation of practices inherited from privateering and earlier Caribbean buccaneers. The replication of these structures at scale in Nassau demonstrates how pirate hubs evolved from tactical hideouts into sophisticated social and economic systems. The community's strategic position also facilitated intelligence gathering and operational planning. Pirates stationed in Nassau could observe convoy movements from the surrounding quays, maintain lookout networks, and exchange information about naval patrols or merchant traffic with sympathetic merchants. Ship logs and intercepted correspondence indicate that Nassau served as a coordination point for multi-ship raids, enabling simultaneous assaults across multiple islands or on heavily trafficked shipping lanes. This capacity to centralize planning without central authority represents a distinctive feature of the Golden Age. Operational coordination arose from shared economic and security interests rather than formal state sanction. Several notable captains emerged during Nassau's period of prominence, demonstrating the capacity of the hub to support large-scale piracy. Figures such as Benjamin Hornigold, Black Sam Bellamy, and Edward Teach, Blackbeard, leveraged the community's resources to organize crews, acquire vessels, and execute extended campaigns. Contemporary reports note that Hornigold, in particular, acted as a de facto coordinator among pirate factions, enforcing codes of conduct and resolving disputes, illustrating the hybrid of autonomy and quasi-hierarchy that characterized Nassau society. The ability to operate at scale, facilitated by these organizational structures, contributed directly to the surge of piracy in the Atlantic during the second wave of the Golden Age. Interactions between Nassau and colonial governments were complex and often ambiguous. Governors occasionally attempted to impose authority, issuing proclamations against piracy or attempting to arrest prominent figures. At the same time, letters and administrative reports reveal instances of tacit tolerance, where authorities prioritize trade facilitation, local economic stability, or political expediency over strict enforcement. This ambiguity created a strategic window that allowed pirates to consolidate operations and integrate with existing commercial systems, reinforcing the structural foundations of the Republic of Pirates. The duality of informal autonomy combined with conditional tolerance exemplifies how frontier zones can generate robust alternative governance systems when formal oversight is absent or unevenly enforced. Logistical infrastructure in Nassau also contributed to sustained pirate activity. Shipyards, blacksmiths, and storage facilities were adapted to meet the specific needs of pirate vessels, enabling rapid repair, refitting, and provisioning between raids. Accounts from merchants and sailors indicate that warehouses contained both legal and plundered goods, and that supply chains extended to neighboring islands such as Eleuthera and the Exumas. The capacity to operate independently for extended periods reduced reliance on European ports and minimized exposure to naval interdiction. This semi-permanent infrastructure represents a structural insight. The physical and commercial resources of Nassau were as critical to pirate success as the skill of individual captains and crews. By integrating governance, economic coordination, and strategic geography, Nassau exemplified a functional autonomous maritime society. Its combination of participatory decision-making, informal law, resource networks, and geographic advantage enabled pirates to conduct sustained, coordinated operations across the Caribbean. Archaeological surveys and contemporary correspondence confirm the density of activity, the diversity of residents, and the adaptability of infrastructure, demonstrating that the hub was not a transient phenomenon but a durable center of piracy during the height of the Golden Age. Nassau's stability and resource networks allowed notorious captains to operate at scale, consolidating crews, coordinating attacks on convoys, and maintaining semi-permanent bases. These conditions fostered the second wave of Atlantic piracy, in which raiding became both economically sophisticated and strategically ambitious. The operational, social, and economic lessons developed in Nassau would influence pirate practices across the Caribbean and Atlantic throughout the early 18th century. The Golden Age was defined by commanders who blended maritime skill with improvisational strategies. Between 1714 and 1726, a cohort of experienced and audacious leaders emerged, transforming piracy from a sporadic opportunistic activity into a coordinated, high-stakes enterprise across the Caribbean and Atlantic. Figures such as Edward Teach, commonly known as Blackbeard Charles Vane, Calico Jack Rackham, and the female pirates in Bonnie and Mary Red, exemplified the synthesis of nautical expertise, tactical innovation, and crew management that characterized this period. Contemporary trial records, ship logs, depositions, and colonial correspondence provide detailed insights into their methods, revealing how operational ingenuity and strategic use of fear underpinned both tactical success and organizational cohesion. Edward Teach, operating primarily off the coasts of the Carolinas and the West Indies, exemplifies the use of intimidation and psychological warfare as an operational tool. Reports from merchant vessels and colonial officials describe his flagship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, flying multiple flags to signal false nationality before attacks. Teach utilized deception to approach heavily armed merchantmen undetected, combining speed, firepower, and aggressive boarding tactics to secure rapid surrender. Testimonies from captured crews detail his deliberate cultivation of fear, setting fuses alight in his beard and hair before engagement, and issuing threats designed to compel compliance without extended combat. This approach minimized casualties, reduced damage to captured vessels, and maximized profit, a calculated adaptation to the logistical and economic constraints faced by pirate crews. Charles Vane, in contrast, demonstrated operational flexibility through mobility and resistance to conventional naval authority. Depositions and admiralty records describe his tendency to abandon prolonged blockades in favor of opportunistic strikes, often leveraging knowledge of local geography, hidden anchorages, and small cays. Vane's crews engaged in selective raiding, prioritizing lightly defended merchant vessels while avoiding confrontation with larger warships. His insistence on strict adherence to pirate codes aboard his ships maintained cohesion, particularly in high-risk operations. Vane's command illustrates the interplay between disciplined internal governance and adaptive external strategy, a hallmark of successful pirate operations during the peak of the Golden Age. Calico Jack Rackham provides insight into leadership dynamics within small-scale pirate crews. Evidence from trial records indicates that Rackham emphasized participatory decision-making and collective enforcement of codes. Shares of plunder were distributed according to pre-agreed formulas, and disputes over discipline or strategy were often resolved in on-board assemblies. This model of decentralized authority allowed crews to operate effectively under conditions of extreme uncertainty and risk, while also creating incentives for loyalty and cooperation. Rackham's operational record, though less marked by high-value captures than some contemporaries, illustrates the integration of democratic governance into maritime raiding practices, a feature that distinguished Golden Age piracy from both privateering and naval service. And Bonnie and Mary Red offer critical insight into gender and operational roles within pirate crews. Trial testimonies and eyewitness accounts reveal that both women actively participated in boarding actions, firearm exchanges, and strategic planning, challenging assumptions that piracy was a purely male domain. Their involvement demonstrates that operational capability, rather than formal recognition or social convention, determined participation in combat and decision-making. Bonnie and Reed also exemplify the adaptability of pirate crews. Flexible assignment of roles, respect for competence, and rapid integration of capable individuals were key to sustaining high-performance operations across dispersed maritime theaters. Tactical methodology during this period relied on a combination of speed, surprise, and psychological manipulation. Pirates frequently employed small, fast vessels capable of overtaking merchant ships and evading larger warships. Ship logs and captured correspondence indicate that attacks were often coordinated around predictable convoy movements, seasonal trade patterns, and known port schedules. Pirates employed ruses such as flying false colors, concealing armaments, and staging deceptive maneuvers to maximize tactical advantage. Once a target was approached, intimidation through display of firepower, boarding threats, or negotiated surrender often proved more effective than protracted combat. This approach conserved resources, reduced casualties, and ensured the profitability of each engagement. Ransom practices and hostage negotiation further supplemented operational strategy. Captured officers and wealthy passengers were frequently held for ransom, a practice documented in colonial dispatches and personal accounts. These procedures required disciplined internal management. Crews needed to enforce compliance, maintain security, and manage provisions while negotiations proceeded. Evidence from the deposition of captured crews indicates that pirate captains developed clear hierarchies and assigned responsibilities for overseeing prisoners, coordinating with intermediaries, and distributing ransom payments. These administrative competencies highlight that piracy combined tactical skill with structured internal organization, enabling operations to be both profitable and sustainable over extended periods. Internal governance on pirate vessels also contributed to operational success. Primary sources describe the role of quartermasters as balancing authority between captain and crew, mediating disputes, and ensuring adherence to agreed-upon codes. Decision-making regarding targets, plunder division, and strategic movement often involved assemblies in which all crew members had a voice. This participatory approach reduced mutiny risk, incentivized engagement, and allowed captains to concentrate on navigation, combat, and broader operational planning. The combination of hierarchical command and decentralized decision-making optimized efficiency under conditions of high risk and limited oversight. The impact of these operational methods extended beyond individual success. By standardizing practices such as crew governance, tactical deception, and resource management, pirate commanders created a replicable framework that influenced subsequent raiding strategies. Contemporary reports from colonial governors, naval officers, and East India Company officials repeatedly reference the effectiveness of coordinated boarding, psychological intimidation, and rapid mobility, indicating recognition of the operational sophistication developed during this period. These developments carry several interpretive insights. First, Golden Age piracy was underpinned by a deliberate combination of skill, improvisation, and internal discipline. It was not a disorderly or random phenomenon. Second, the integration of semi-democratic governance aboard ships highlights the adaptive social structures that enabled diverse crews to operate efficiently under extreme conditions. Third, operational success relied on both tactical flexibility and strategic understanding of trade networks, seasonal movements, and naval deployment, demonstrating the sophistication of pirate intelligence and planning. By 1726, the cumulative effect of these commanders' strategies had established the Golden Age as a period of unprecedented pirate influence. Crews were organized, tactical methods were refined, and operational hubs like Nassau allowed sustained, coordinated campaigns across the Caribbean and Atlantic. The effectiveness of these leaders drew the attention of colonial and metropolitan authorities, who increasingly recognized that ad hoc enforcement would no longer suffice. As pirate activity expanded, imperial authorities coordinated stronger suppression efforts. Pirate leadership relied on negotiated authority rather than absolute command. Unlike naval vessels, where captains exercised near-total control over operations, pirate ships implemented a system in which authority was distributed, constrained, and often subject to crew consensus. Contemporary trial records, ship logs, and depositions from captured crews reveal that captains were selected based on skill, experience, and charisma, rather than through inheritance or formal appointment. The captain's role primarily focused on navigation, combat decisions, and overall strategic direction, while operational checks were maintained through assemblies, councils, and the office of the quartermaster. This structure allowed for both operational efficiency and internal accountability, reducing the risk of mutiny and ensuring compliance in high-stakes environments. The quartermaster occupied a central position in this governance framework. Acting as a counterbalance to the captain, the quartermaster oversaw prize distribution, maintained discipline, and represented crew interests in disputes. Evidence from Admiralty depositions and pirate codes, such as those documented in Bartholomew Roberts' ship articles, indicates that quartermasters often had the authority to veto or moderate the captain's decisions regarding plunder allocation, punishment, and target selection. This division of power created a dual command system that reinforced fairness, mitigated abuse, and facilitated rapid decision-making in the dynamic context of raiding and maritime navigation. Selection processes were typically democratic, with captains and quartermasters elected or reaffirmed by the crew at the outset of a voyage. Removal or replacement of officers was possible in cases of misconduct, incompetence, or loss of confidence, ensuring that leadership remained responsive to the collective interests of the crew. Shipboard assemblies, convened in open forums, allowed all members to voice grievances, vote on proposed actions, and approve distributions of captured goods. Records from Caribbean depositions in the 1710s demonstrate that these assemblies could effectively resolve disputes without recourse to formal courts, maintaining cohesion and operational stability during extended periods at sea. Comparative analysis with naval hierarchy underscores the distinctiveness of pirate governance. While naval captains operated within strict chains of command, subject to admiralty regulations and often reinforced by corporal punishment, pirate leadership depended on negotiation, consensus, and transparency. Logs from Royal Navy encounters with pirates frequently note frustration at the apparent independence of pirate crews and their collective decision-making, highlighting the structural divergence from conventional maritime authority. These differences reflect both the unique operational environment faced by pirates and the socio-economic composition of their crews, which included skilled sailors accustomed to agency and share-based incentives. Internal codes codified key aspects of governance, including rules for prize sharing, compensation for injury, and conduct during engagements. Captain and quartermaster authority was always framed within these written or orally agreed-upon articles, providing clear expectations for all crew members. Archival evidence from Edward Lowe and Calico Jack Rackham indicates that adherence to such codes was strictly enforced. Violations could result in fines, marooning, or other collective sanctions. These mechanisms formalized checks on authority, creating a balance between operational control and participatory oversight. Interpretive insights from this governance structure reveal its functional significance. First, the distribution of authority enhanced operational resilience. By allowing crews to influence decisions, pirate vessels could respond adaptively to changing tactical conditions and environmental uncertainties. Second, the integration of democratic processes facilitated cohesion among diverse crews, composed of multiple nationalities and varying skill levels, by creating predictable rules and channels for redress. Third, the dual command system minimized internal conflict while preserving decisional clarity in moments of combat, illustrating the sophisticated blending of flexibility and structure that characterized Golden Age piracy. Leadership practices also influenced broader social dynamics aboard ship. Captains and quartermasters not only directed navigation and raids but also mediated disputes, organized labor, and coordinated interactions with local communities or merchants. These responsibilities extended to maintaining morale, enforcing discipline, and ensuring equitable participation in plunder, thereby embedding governance within daily life. Trial records from 1718 to 1720 note that captains often acted in consultation with officers and assembly-approved advisors, demonstrating the operational integration of authority and communal oversight. By distributing power, codifying responsibilities, and enabling collective decision-making, pirate leadership exemplified an alternative model of maritime governance. This system allowed crews to operate efficiently under conditions of high risk, complex logistics, and intermittent external enforcement, while ensuring accountability, fairness, and cohesion. These leadership structures shaped daily social interactions, influencing discipline, labor allocation, and onboard community life. Pirate crews reflected the demographic complexity of the Atlantic world. Unlike naval or merchant vessels of the early 18th century, which were often organized along national or linguistic lines, pirate ships integrated sailors from multiple ethnicities, nationalities, and social backgrounds. Archival records, including depositions from captured pirates and port registries, document the presence of English, French, Dutch, Spanish, and Portuguese sailors, alongside individuals of African, Caribbean, and indigenous descent. This diversity was particularly pronounced in Caribbean and Atlantic hubs such as Nassau, New Providence, and Tortuga, where frontier labor markets and maritime mobility facilitated the aggregation of skilled sailors who might otherwise have limited employment opportunities in conventional navies or merchant fleets. Formerly enslaved individuals played a significant role in pirate crews, both as able-bodied seamen and as active participants in operational decision-making. Historical accounts, including trial testimonies and ship logs, indicate that some pirates offered freedom in exchange for service, creating a labor incentive that contrasted sharply with the conditions aboard European naval vessels or plantation ships. These individuals contributed specialized maritime skills, knowledge of local waters, and labor capacity, enhancing both the tactical and operational effectiveness of the crew. The inclusion of formerly enslaved persons also reflects the pragmatic orientation of pirate society. Competence and reliability often outweighed considerations of nationality or social origin. Linguistic diversity within crews presented both challenges and adaptive strategies. Documents from Caribbean pirate communities note the use of pidginized maritime communication, multilingual signals, and code words to facilitate coordination during combat and navigation. Captains and quartermasters often acted as mediators or interpreters, ensuring that operational commands were understood across linguistic boundaries. Such practices demonstrate the capacity of pirate crews to overcome potential barriers posed by cultural and linguistic heterogeneity, maintaining cohesion in high-risk operational contexts. Work distribution aboard pirate vessels was structured yet flexible, reflecting both skill and collective interest. Archival sources, including shipboard articles and depositions, describe divisions of labor encompassing navigation, gunnery, maintenance, boarding operations, and provisioning. While all crew members were expected to contribute to general shipboard tasks, specific responsibilities were allocated according to expertise. For example, experienced navigators directed course plotting, gunners oversaw cannon operation, and carpenters or sailmakers managed repairs. Participation in boarding actions or prize distribution adhered to agreed-upon codes, ensuring equity and reducing conflict. These arrangements combined operational efficiency with participatory oversight, reflecting broader governance norms observed on pirate vessels. The social composition of crews also influenced interpersonal relations and discipline. Evidence from trial records indicates that egalitarian practices, collective decision-making, and codified punishments helped manage potential tensions arising from ethnic or cultural diversity. Assemblies, convened to resolve disputes, approve actions, or ratify share allocations, provided structured mechanisms for dialogue and consent, preventing factionalism. Historians have interpreted these processes as integral to maintaining cohesion, particularly given the high stakes of extended maritime campaigns and the autonomous nature of pirate operations. Interpretive insights underscore the functional significance of multicultural integration. First, diverse crews enabled the pooling of specialized skills, local knowledge, and tactical experience, directly enhancing operational effectiveness. Second, the pragmatic incorporation of formerly enslaved individuals illustrates the adaptive labor strategies that defined pirate society, offering opportunities for upward mobility unavailable in contemporary naval or commercial contexts. Third, the development of multilingual communication and participatory work structures demonstrates the social and organizational flexibility necessary for sustained autonomous operations across vast and dispersed maritime environments. Pirate crews thus constituted microcosms of the broader Atlantic world, reflecting patterns of mobility, labor displacement, and social negotiation. Their organization was both hierarchical and egalitarian. Leadership roles guided strategy and combat, while inclusive labor practices and codified norms maintained cohesion among a heterogeneous membership. This balance between authority, skill, and participation enabled pirates to conduct coordinated raids, manage complex logistical operations, and sustain semi-permanent communities in frontier zones. Crew composition also had broader operational implications. Multicultural integration allowed pirate vessels to navigate diverse regional contexts, interact with varied trading networks, and exploit knowledge accumulated across different maritime theaters. Shipboard labor practices, codified in articles and enforced through assemblies, ensured equitable distribution of both risk and reward, reinforcing loyalty and reducing internal conflict. The result was a labor system finely tuned to the high-risk, high-reward environment of Golden Age piracy. Crew organization influenced life on board ship, shaping social norms, discipline, and daily operational routines that define the functioning of pirate communities. Surviving at sea required constant attention to basic logistical maintenance. On pirate vessels, daily life was governed as much by practical necessity as by operational strategy. Shipboard routines were structured around navigation, combat readiness, and the management of essential supplies. Contemporary accounts, including ship logs, colonial correspondence, and depositions from captured pirates, indicate that diet, water storage, sanitation, and accommodation were central to maintaining crew health and operational capacity. Limited space and the demands of extended voyages required careful allocation of resources and the establishment of predictable routines, which formed the backbone of functional pirate communities. Diet aboard pirate ships was simple but pragmatic. Staples included salted pork, hardtack, dried legumes, and occasionally rice or grains purchased or captured in port. Fresh provisions, when available, were rationed carefully to minimize spoilage. Archaeological evidence from shipwrecks and contemporaneous provisioning records confirms that crews supplemented these rations with locally sourced fish, game, and fruits during coastal stops. Nutrition was further augmented by captured goods, including sugar, rum, and other commodities, which served both as sustenance and as currency for crew morale and incentive structures. Water storage presented a constant logistical challenge. Ships carried casks of fresh water, but prolonged voyages or high temperatures accelerated spoilage. Logs and correspondence from Caribbean and Atlantic voyages indicate that captains instituted regular water rationing, rotating storage casks, and supplementing supplies through rainfall collection or bartering in port. The management of water was closely tied to daily routines. Morning and evening rationing, careful monitoring of cask integrity, and disciplined enforcement by the quartermaster ensured that critical supplies lasted for the duration of a voyage. Disease and medical conditions posed persistent threats. Contemporary accounts describe outbreaks of scurvy, dysentery, and respiratory illnesses, exacerbated by close quarters and inadequate sanitation. Evidence from colonial hospital records and pirate depositions indicates that crews implemented preventative measures when possible, including controlled diet supplementation, cleaning routines, and isolation of sick individuals. Surgeons or crew members with medical experience administered rudimentary care, often relying on herbal remedies, basic surgical procedures, and hygiene practices adapted to the constraints of shipboard life. Despite these measures, mortality from disease remained a significant operational concern. Accommodations aboard pirate vessels were cramped and austere. Crew slept in hammocks or shared bunks below deck, while officers occupied small cabins or designated areas with marginally improved ventilation. Contemporary testimonies and sketches of pirate vessels suggest that space was optimized for operational needs rather than comfort. Storage for provisions, armaments, and navigational equipment took precedence, with crew living quarters overlapping functional zones. Efficient use of limited space was critical to sustaining morale and maintaining readiness during extended periods at sea. Combat preparation constituted a central component of daily routines. Drills, gunnery practice, and boarding exercises were conducted regularly, often coordinated by captains or quartermasters to maintain proficiency. Depositions from captured crews note that weapons maintenance, cannon loading, and strategic planning occurred in parallel with routine navigation and provisioning. These activities reinforced discipline, familiarity with equipment, and coordinated operational response, ensuring that crews remained capable of executing raids or evading naval interception. Overall, shipboard routines were highly regimented yet flexible enough to respond to changing conditions. Tasks were distributed according to expertise, rotational watches were maintained for navigation and lookout duties, and assemblies were convened for decision-making or dispute resolution. Logs and first-hand accounts describe a balance between structured labor and participatory oversight, reflecting broader governance norms within pirate communities. These practices sustained the physical and operational viability of crews, while embedding social and economic structures that enabled extended maritime activity. Interpretive insights highlight the significance of daily life management. First, logistical competence directly affected operational effectiveness. Adequate food, water, and health management allowed sustained raiding capability. Second, structured routines provided cohesion and discipline, reinforcing governance norms and ensuring that heterogeneous crews could function efficiently under high-risk conditions. Third, the integration of practical survival skills with strategic preparation illustrates the complex interplay between daily routines and broader operational objectives during the Golden Age of Piracy. These systems of life, health, and operational preparation supported the broader economic structure of piracy. By maintaining crew functionality, mitigating disease, and ensuring resource sustainability, pirate vessels could conduct extended raids, manage plunder effectively, and integrate with semi-permanent hubs such as Nassau. Daily shipboard practices thus represented the foundation upon which the social, economic, and strategic dimensions of pirate society were constructed. These systems supported a broader economic structure, enabling sustained plunder, trade, and the development of semi-autonomous pirate networks. Pirate economics depended on predictable maritime commerce. During the Golden Age, pirates targeted the flow of goods that underpinned Atlantic and Caribbean trade, relying on knowledge of shipping schedules, convoy patterns, and port networks to maximize profit. Typical targets included Spanish galleons laden with bullion, English and Dutch merchant vessels carrying sugar, molasses, cotton, and rum, and smaller coastal craft transporting regional commodities. Archival records, including admiralty reports, merchant correspondence, and captured ship manifests, indicate that pirates systematically selected ships based on size, cargo value, crew complement, and defensive capabilities, optimizing the likelihood of successful seizure with minimal risk. Trade goods were central to pirate economic planning. Bullion, silver, gold, and coins provided both immediate liquidity and the capacity to purchase supplies in pirate-friendly ports. Commodity cargoes, including sugar, tobacco, indigo, and textiles, were converted into cash through resale to merchants willing to operate discreetly within semi-autonomous pirate communities, such as Nassau or Tortuga. Archaeological finds from shipwrecks and recovered cargoes illustrate the diversity of goods appropriated during raids, revealing a pattern of both high-value targeting and opportunistic acquisition. The consistency of these goods along established trade routes made them predictable and allowed pirate commanders to plan operations strategically. Ship types influenced tactical approaches. Large, armed vessels such as galleons or merchantmen with onboard guns were typically engaged using a combination of speed, deception, and coordinated boarding actions. Smaller, lightly armed ships, coasters, sloops, and schooners, were often overtaken directly or forced to surrender under threat of force. Testimonies from captured crews and depositions of pirate captains document the use of false flags, night approaches, and positioning maneuvers to reduce resistance and maximize efficiency. These methods reflect a calculated understanding of maritime engineering, wind patterns, and naval tactics, demonstrating that piracy required both nautical expertise and adaptive strategy. Capture strategies were often complemented by psychological and coercive techniques. Pirates frequently employed intimidation, bluff, and displays of firepower to compel surrender without protracted combat, preserving both ship and cargo. Ransom and hostage practices were also integrated into operational methods, particularly for high-value targets or vessels carrying wealthy passengers. Primary sources, including trial accounts and colonial correspondence, indicate that disciplined enforcement of agreed-upon codes ensured that crews executed these methods uniformly, maintaining cohesion and operational effectiveness. Loot management was a critical consideration in pirate economics. Distribution followed codified formulas that allocated shares based on rank, contribution, and injury sustained, as evidenced in surviving pirate articles and contemporary depositions. Captains typically received double shares, quartermasters 1.5, and ordinary crew members single shares, with additional compensation for wounded or otherwise disadvantaged members. This transparent system of allocation reinforced discipline, incentivized participation in risk, and minimized internal conflict, ensuring that plunder could be effectively monetized and reinvested in further operations. Interpretive insights highlight the systemic logic of pirate targeting and seizure. First, predictable trade flows shaped operational decision-making, allowing pirate captains to select targets based on economic potential rather than opportunistic preference. Second, integration of tactical skill, psychological manipulation, and codified internal management demonstrates the sophistication of pirate operational economics. Third, the combination of bullion acquisition, commodity resale, and strategic division of plunder created a self-sustaining economic model capable of supporting extended campaigns and semi-permanent bases. By combining intelligence, naval expertise, and codified distribution practices, pirate operations functioned as organized economic enterprises rather than unstructured predation. The systematic selection of targets, management of captured goods, and enforcement of share systems exemplify how piracy integrated with and exploited broader patterns of Atlantic and Caribbean commerce. Loot required an extensive distribution system, linking pirate seizures to semi-legal markets, supply networks, and provisioning hubs that sustained operational continuity. Pirate goods circulated through networks that linked illicit trade to legal commerce. Following the capture of valuable cargo, pirates relied on semi-formalized markets to convert plunder into usable resources, provisions, and capital for future operations. Key nodes included Nassau on New Providence Island, parts of the Bahamian archipelago, and select ports in North America and the Caribbean, where merchants, innkeepers, and intermediaries participated in the discreet resale of commodities. Colonial correspondence and port records from the early 18th century indicate that these actors operated in a gray zone of legality, balancing commercial opportunity against the risk of prosecution. The result was a functional system that allowed pirate economies to interface with wider Atlantic commerce. Fencing operations played a central role in this network. Captured goods, including bullion, textiles, sugar, and firearms, were exchanged through trusted intermediaries who maintained connections with both pirate crews and local merchants. Depositions and court records from 1715 to 1725 document transactions where merchants agreed to accept stolen commodities at discounted rates, reselling them through conventional trade channels. These arrangements enabled pirates to obtain essential supplies, pay crew shares, and fund subsequent voyages, while creating a degree of plausible deniability for civilian participants. Archaeological evidence, such as recovered inventories from Nassau warehouses, confirms the presence of mixed legal and illicit goods, demonstrating the operational integration of these markets. Smuggling complemented fencing by facilitating the transport of contraband across colonial borders. Pirates and merchants exploited regulatory gaps, shallow coastal waters, and complex archipelagic geography to move goods without inspection. Contemporary correspondence from colonial governors notes frequent interdictions and captures, but also emphasizes the difficulty of policing extensive coastlines and dispersed islands. The circulation of pirate-acquired commodities relied on this semi-clandestine movement, ensuring that valuable plunder could reach buyers while minimizing exposure to naval enforcement. These practices highlight the adaptive strategies used to sustain pirate operations within a partially regulated maritime environment. Cooperation with colonial actors was often pragmatic and opportunistic. Merchants, local officials, and tavern owners provided provisioning, intelligence, and logistical support in exchange for profit. Letters and reports from the period describe instances where colonial authorities tacitly tolerated pirate activity to maintain economic stability or avoid disruption of local trade networks. In some cases, governors leveraged pirate presence to extract revenue, negotiate peace, or secure strategic advantage against rival colonies. This cooperative dimension underscores the structural embeddedness of piracy within broader colonial economies, illustrating how illicit maritime activity could coexist with formal governance when incentives aligned. Pirate networks also included communication and intelligence mechanisms. Information regarding convoy schedules, port defenses, and naval deployments circulated rapidly between hubs such as Nassau, Charleston, and Port Royal. Ship logs, intercepted correspondence, and colonial reports indicate that these informal channels enabled coordinated raids and reduced the risk of surprise interception. By integrating intelligence gathering, provisioning, and fencing within a cohesive operational framework, pirate crews were able to sustain long-term campaigns despite being outside formal economic and legal systems. Interpretive insights underscore the systemic logic of these practices. First, semi-formal markets allowed pirates to monetize plunder efficiently, transforming captured goods into operational resources and crew incentives. Second, smuggling and clandestine transport mechanisms reduced exposure to enforcement while linking pirate activity to regional commerce. Third, pragmatic cooperation with colonial actors demonstrates that piracy functioned within a negotiated economic environment rather than in absolute isolation, reflecting adaptive strategies to complex Atlantic world conditions. By connecting the capture of valuable cargo with structured networks of fencing, smuggling, and colonial cooperation, pirates created a resilient economic ecosystem. These systems allowed raiders to convert risk into profit, sustain crews, and maintain semi-permanent bases, forming the material foundation for the operational and social dimensions of Golden Age piracy. These networks supported pirate sustainability, enabling prolonged campaigns, the maintenance of semi-permanent hubs, and the consolidation of economic and social structures necessary for continued maritime predation. Loot distribution reflected standardized expectations across crews. The division of plunder during the Golden Age of Piracy followed codified formulas designed to ensure fairness, maintain cohesion, and incentivize participation. Primary sources, including surviving pirate articles, trial testimonies, and depositions from captured crews, provide detailed accounts of share systems. Typically, captains received double shares, quartermasters 1.5, and ordinary crew members single shares. Additional compensation was granted to those wounded or otherwise disadvantaged during engagements, reinforcing both equity and operational commitment. This system of allocation exemplifies the structured financial incentives that underpinned pirate organization. Accounting practices on pirate vessels were methodical, reflecting the importance of transparent distribution. Loot was inventoried immediately following capture with designated officers, often the quartermaster or appointed stewards, recording quantities, weights, and types of goods. Documentation, when maintained, included lists of participants, the condition of captured items, and planned allocations. Colonial depositions indicate that disputes over shares were resolved through shipboard assemblies, where all crew members could voice concerns and ratify distributions. This combination of formalized recording and participatory oversight reduced the potential for conflict, ensuring that economic rewards reinforced, rather than undermined, social cohesion aboard the vessel. Distribution rules extended beyond immediate division to account for risk, labor, and skill. Skilled sailors, gunners, and navigators often received preferential treatment in share calculations, recognizing the operational value of expertise. Trial records and contemporary narratives indicate that special compensation was accorded to those injured or disabled during raids, establishing early principles of risk-adjusted remuneration. This system incentivized performance, mitigated grievances, and fostered loyalty, ensuring that crews remained motivated during prolonged campaigns and hazardous operations. Comparative analysis with naval and merchant wages highlights the economic rationale behind pirate participation. Ordinary sailors in European navies or merchant fleets typically received low and irregular pay, often delayed for months, coupled with harsh disciplinary measures and minimal prospects for advancement. In contrast, the pirate share system offered immediate, transparent, and potentially substantial rewards tied directly to successful operations. Archival wage tables and naval logs from the period underscore that the potential for rapid accumulation of wealth aboard pirate vessels was a powerful draw, particularly for skilled seamen facing structural unemployment or wage stagnation following wars. Interpretive insights emphasize the broader significance of these financial structures. First, standardized plunder division illustrates the rationalization of risk and reward, aligning incentives with operational objectives. Second, participatory accounting and dispute resolution contributed to social stability, reinforcing governance practices that complemented tactical decision-making. Third, economic motivation functioned as both an attractor and a stabilizer, providing a measurable return for labor, skill, and risk that conventional maritime employment rarely matched. The predictability and fairness of loot distribution also enabled coordination across semi-permanent pirate hubs and longer expeditions. Crews could rely on consistent expectations when joining vessels, negotiating contracts, or participating in coordinated raids. This predictability facilitated recruitment, reduced turnover, and enhanced operational continuity, allowing pirate networks to expand their reach across the Caribbean, Atlantic, and Indian Ocean theaters. Nevertheless, economic incentives alone were insufficient to safeguard piracy from external pressures. Even with well-structured share systems and immediate financial reward, pirate crews faced expanding state power, naval patrols, and legal reprisals. Colonial governors and metropolitan authorities increasingly coordinated suppression efforts, leveraging both military force and legal frameworks to challenge pirate operations. Historical correspondence, admiralty dispatches, and trial records indicate that the financial allure of piracy could not fully counteract the systemic risks imposed by coordinated state intervention. By institutionalizing share systems, formalizing accounting procedures, and providing risk-adjusted incentives, pirates created an internally coherent economic model that sustained extended maritime campaigns. The standardized division of plunder reinforced governance, motivated diverse crews, and enabled operational resilience, while simultaneously exposing piracy to the vulnerabilities inherent in confrontation with organized state power. Economic motivations alone could not protect piracy from expanding state power, foreshadowing the intensification of suppression campaigns in the latter Golden Age. European states increasingly defined piracy as a direct threat to imperial commerce. Prior to the late 17th century, piracy was often treated as a quasi-private or local offense, with enforcement varying by colony and naval capacity. The passing of the 1698 Piracy Act in England marked a deliberate shift toward the formal criminalization of piracy, establishing clear definitions of offenses, procedures for prosecution, and penalties for convicted pirates. This legislation codified earlier informal practices while aligning colonial and metropolitan authority, ensuring that acts of maritime predation could no longer be treated as mere private disputes or tolerated as extensions of economic competition. The 1717 Piracy Act further centralized legal authority, introducing provisions that allowed for the establishment of specialized admiralty courts in colonies with limited local judicial capacity. These courts, operating without juries, were empowered to expedite trials, enforce uniform sentencing, and process cases across a wide geographical area. Contemporary colonial correspondence and trial records indicate that this restructuring enabled more consistent enforcement, reduced legal loopholes, and reinforced metropolitan oversight over semi-autonomous pirate hubs such as Nassau. By codifying evidence requirements, procedural standards, and appeals processes, the acts created a predictable and systematic legal framework designed to deter piracy through certainty of prosecution. Legal reforms were supported by a broader imperial strategy that integrated diplomacy, intelligence, and judicial oversight. Colonial governors were tasked with gathering evidence, coordinating with naval detachments, and maintaining registries of known pirates. Reports from the Caribbean and Atlantic theaters demonstrate that governors increasingly leveraged local populations, informants, and commercial networks to identify and apprehend offenders. The combination of codified law and active enforcement marked a significant evolution from earlier, ad hoc responses, signaling a recognition by European states of piracy as a systemic challenge to imperial commerce and authority. Interpretive insights highlight the implications of these reforms. First, the formal criminalization of piracy reflected the growing centrality of maritime trade to imperial economies. Attacks on shipping were no longer tolerated as marginal or opportunistic. Second, the establishment of specialized courts illustrates the adaptation of legal institutions to the transnational and mobile nature of piracy, ensuring that prosecution could match the operational reach of pirate networks. Third, the integration of legal and administrative mechanisms reinforced broader governance strategies, linking judicial authority to naval and diplomatic initiatives in a coordinated imperial response. The acts also delineated the relationship between privateering and piracy, eliminating ambiguities that had previously allowed former privateers to operate in a legal gray zone. Letters of marque and commissions were more strictly regulated, with violations clearly categorized as piracy under the law. Trial records and admiralty reports show that these distinctions were actively enforced, with former privateers apprehended and prosecuted for overstepping their commissions. This legal clarification curtailed the transitional space in which sailors could operate semi-legally while maintaining continuity of maritime skills and labor in illicit enterprises. Evidence from contemporary court proceedings indicates that these reforms had tangible effects on pirate behavior. Prosecution records reveal increased caution among crews, more selective targeting of ships, and the relocation of bases to less regulated areas such as the Indian Ocean or remote Caribbean coves. While the laws themselves did not immediately end piracy, they created a predictable risk environment that gradually undermined the operational viability of long-term raiding networks. Historical analysis suggests that these legal measures were effective when paired with naval action and intelligence gathering, demonstrating the interdependence of legislative and military strategies. By codifying offenses, centralizing judicial authority, and clarifying the legal status of maritime predation, European states transformed piracy from a tolerated hazard into a prosecutable crime with systemic consequences. The 1698 and 1717 Piracy Acts exemplify the evolution of imperial law in response to the economic and political significance of maritime trade. They established the procedural, evidentiary, and administrative foundation necessary for sustained suppression campaigns, setting the stage for subsequent naval reorganization and operational enforcement. Legal changes required complementary naval action, as statutes alone could not eliminate piracy without the deployment of disciplined maritime forces to enforce them across vast and contested waters. The Royal Navy's expanded presence gradually reduced pirate operational zones. Following legal reforms such as the 1698 and 1717 Piracy Acts, metropolitan authorities prioritized the deployment of naval assets to protect maritime commerce and suppress pirate activity. Fleet records, admiralty correspondence, and colonial reports indicate that ships were assigned to key regions including the Caribbean, the Bahamian archipelago, and the North American seaboard, where piracy had previously flourished. Patrols focused on known pirate bases, frequently trafficked shipping lanes, and strategic choke points, effectively constraining pirate mobility and imposing operational risk on raiding expeditions. Convoy protection became a central element of these campaigns. Merchant vessels traveling between Europe, the Caribbean, and North America were organized into escorted formations, leveraging naval firepower and coordinated routing to deter attacks. Contemporary shipping logs and correspondence describe the implementation of convoy schedules, signaling protocols, and coordinated intelligence sharing between naval commanders and colonial authorities. The presence of heavily armed warships alongside commercial vessels significantly reduced the vulnerability of high-value targets, disrupting the economic calculations that had underpinned piracy and forcing raiders to seek less profitable or more remote targets. Technological and tactical improvements further enhanced naval effectiveness. Ships deployed for anti-piracy operations were often faster, more maneuverable, and better armed than those used in earlier decades, incorporating advances in hull design, rigging, and cannonry. Officers trained in gunnery, boarding tactics, and long-range reconnaissance coordinated patrols to maximize coverage of pirate-prone regions. Reports from Admiralty dispatches note that coordinated blockades, surprise sweeps, and intelligence-driven interdiction allowed naval forces to project power over vast maritime spaces, gradually reducing the number of safe havens available to pirate crews. Regional campaigns illustrate the operational implementation of these strategies. In the Caribbean, squadrons targeted Nassau and other semi-autonomous settlements, dismantling the logistical infrastructure that supported extended pirate activity. In North American waters, naval detachments disrupted small-scale raiding along trade routes and coastal settlements, relying on both pursuit and intelligence from local informants. In the Atlantic, fast cruisers intercepted vessels attempting transatlantic transit without convoy protection, demonstrating the ability of organized naval forces to impose systemic pressure on pirate networks. Contemporary letters and reports highlight both the successes and limitations of these operations, reflecting the challenges of policing extensive maritime territories with finite resources. Interpretive insights underscore the impact of these measures. First, The expansion of naval patrols exemplifies the integration of military, legal, and administrative strategies in counter-piracy efforts, linking operational enforcement directly to legislative reforms. Second, convoy systems and intelligence coordination altered the cost-benefit calculations of piracy, making long-distance raids increasingly hazardous and reducing potential profit margins. Third, technological improvements and tactical innovation enhanced the reach and effectiveness of enforcement, demonstrating that piracy could be contained not solely through legal sanction but through sustained operational pressure. The combination of patrols, convoy protection, and regional campaigns had broader implications for pirate networks. Bases that had previously functioned with semi-autonomous governance, such as Nassau, faced direct disruption. Supply lines were interrupted, and the movement of plundered goods became more perilous. Crew cohesion and recruitment were affected as the risk of interception increased, forcing pirates to reconsider operational zones, targets, and engagement strategies. Admiralty records indicate a measurable decline in piracy-related incidents in heavily patrolled sectors by the 1720s, suggesting that sustained naval pressure was effective in reshaping the operational landscape of the Golden Age. Nevertheless, suppression was neither immediate nor absolute. Pirates adapted by relocating to less monitored areas, employing faster ships, and timing raids to exploit gaps in naval coverage. Historical correspondence underscores that effective counter-piracy required persistent presence, coordinated strategy, and integration with legal mechanisms. The Royal Navy's campaigns demonstrate the necessity of combining enforcement with governance, illustrating the systemic approach required to contain maritime predation on an imperial scale. By deploying fleets strategically, protecting merchant convoys, and integrating technological and tactical advances, the Royal Navy gradually constrained pirate mobility and reduced operational safe havens. These measures not only enforced legal frameworks but also reshaped the strategic environment, compelling pirate crews to adapt or face capture. Suppression intensified with targeted political intervention, as colonial governors and metropolitan authorities coordinated legal, military, and diplomatic efforts to dismantle pirate networks systematically. The arrival of Governor Woodes Rogers marked a turning point in anti-piracy policy. In 1718, Rogers sailed to the Bahamas with the dual mandate of re-establishing British authority and suppressing the entrenched pirate presence on New Providence and surrounding islands. Contemporary correspondence, official dispatches, and colonial records document the strategic significance of his mission. Nassau had long functioned as a semi-autonomous hub for pirate operations, providing safe harbor, logistical support, and markets for plundered goods. Rogers's deployment represented a coordinated imperial effort to combine legal, military, and administrative measures in order to dismantle this network. Negotiation of pardons was central to Rogers's strategy. The 1717 proclamation of King George I offered conditional clemency to pirates who surrendered voluntarily, with the stipulation that further offenses would be prosecuted under the newly enforced Piracy Acts. Rogers personally oversaw the distribution and administration of these pardons, verifying claims and assessing compliance. Records indicate that hundreds of pirates accepted the offer, abandoning their vessels and integrating into lawful colonial society or returning to maritime labor within regulated commerce. This approach combined legal authority with pragmatic incentives, encouraging compliance without immediate reliance on military force, while simultaneously isolating the most recalcitrant elements. Administrative reforms complemented the pardon initiative. Rogers reorganized Nassau's governance, establishing functioning courts, codifying trade regulations, and implementing naval oversight of local waters. Colonial accounts highlight the establishment of a garrison, fortification improvements, and systematic enforcement of customs duties and port registration. These measures disrupted the informal logistical infrastructure that had sustained pirate operations, including warehouses, taverns, and networks of fence merchants. By integrating law, administration, and military presence, Rogers effectively transformed Nassau from a pirate sanctuary into a colonial outpost operating under metropolitan oversight. Interpretive analysis highlights the significance of Rogers's reforms. First, The combination of conditional pardons and structured administration illustrates a multidimensional approach to state building, linking compliance incentives with the imposition of governance structures. Second, the integration of naval and civil authority reinforced the enforcement of imperial law, demonstrating that sustainable suppression required coordinated policy rather than ad hoc military interventions. Third, Rogers's strategy reflects an understanding of social and economic dynamics. By converting former pirates into lawful participants, the colonial government minimized resistance while maintaining essential labor and maritime skills within the economy. Rogers also implemented measures to prevent the resurgence of piracy. Maritime regulations were enforced rigorously, with naval patrols monitoring shipping lanes and harbor entries. Port inspections, registration requirements, and the oversight of commercial transactions reduced opportunities for illicit trade. Colonial reports indicate that these interventions were supported by intelligence networks, informants, and cooperation from neighboring settlements, creating an integrated surveillance and enforcement framework. By combining legal deterrence, administrative control, and targeted military presence, Rogers constrained both the operational mobility and economic sustainability of pirate groups remaining in the region. The results of these efforts were demonstrable. Nassau's semi-autonomous pirate governance was dismantled, warehouses and provisioning networks were repurposed for lawful trade, and the number of active pirate crews operating from the Bahamas declined sharply within a few years. Contemporary accounts describe a transformed political landscape in which remaining pirates either fled to more remote locations or were captured and prosecuted under the 1717 Piracy Act. The coordinated nature of Rogers's campaign illustrates the effectiveness of combining diplomacy, legal authority, and military enforcement in the suppression of entrenched criminal networks. By the conclusion of Rogers's administration, the Bahamas had been reintegrated into the imperial system, serving as both a model of anti-piracy governance and a strategic outpost for continued naval oversight. His approach, conditional pardons, administrative restructuring, and military enforcement, established a precedent for subsequent campaigns against piracy throughout the Atlantic and Caribbean theaters. With Nassau subdued, remaining pirate groups faced escalating pressure, forced either into retreat, surrender, or increasingly perilous raids in peripheral regions beyond the reach of centralized authority. By the late 1720s, remaining pirate captains operated in small, isolated groups. Following sustained naval campaigns, legal enforcement, and administrative reforms in the Caribbean and Atlantic, the semi-autonomous pirate communities that had flourished during the Golden Age had largely collapsed. Records from admiralty courts and colonial correspondence indicate that many prominent figures, including remnants of the Nassau and Madagascar networks, had been captured, executed, or absorbed into lawful maritime labor. Only a handful of seasoned commanders continued operations, typically with reduced crews and limited access to safe harbors. Their activities were increasingly constrained by naval patrols, intelligence networks, and local enforcement, resulting in a highly fragmented operational environment. Surviving pirate leaders adapted to these pressures through mobility and opportunistic raiding. Logs and trial depositions show that isolated groups targeted small merchant vessels along coastal waters or in remote archipelagos, relying on speed and surprise rather than sustained campaigns. Without the support of larger pirate hubs or access to established fencing networks, these crews faced significant logistical challenges, including provisioning, maintenance, and recruitment. Archaeological and textual evidence confirms that pirate activity became sporadic and geographically dispersed, reflecting the diminishing strategic and economic viability of large-scale operations. Fragmentation also affected social cohesion and governance within pirate crews. Articles outlining share systems, leadership elections, and disciplinary measures were less consistently enforced, leading to higher incidences of desertion, mutiny, or internal dispute. Court records from captured pirates illustrate that smaller, ad hoc crews struggled to maintain the organizational norms that had previously enabled efficient raiding and operational resilience. This loss of structural integrity further reduced the threat posed by remaining pirates, as crews were less capable of coordinated action against well-armed merchant convoys or naval forces. Interpretive insights highlight the systemic dynamics of this period. First, the fragmentation of pirate leadership demonstrates the cumulative impact of sustained state intervention, showing how legal, naval, and administrative pressure can disrupt operational networks over time. Second, the shift to small, isolated raiding parties reflects an adaptation strategy constrained by structural limitations, rather than a voluntary contraction of piracy. Third, the decline in internal governance underscores the interdependence of social, economic, and operational structures. When these elements were disrupted, pirate resilience diminished sharply. Despite their reduced numbers, these final pirate groups retained knowledge of maritime tactics, navigational skill, and opportunistic raiding strategies. However, evidence indicates that their effectiveness was increasingly limited to localized, short-term engagements. Reports from colonial governors and naval officers describe the rapid apprehension of surviving pirates, the interception of raiding expeditions, and the systematic dismantling of remaining bases. By combining enforcement, intelligence, and coordinated prosecution, imperial authorities were able to neutralize these last pockets of resistance efficiently. The period also illustrates the broader consequences of the collapse of centralized pirate hubs. With major ports and safe havens secured under imperial control, remaining pirates were forced into peripheral regions or marginal seas, where operational sustainability was low. Economic incentives persisted, but logistical constraints and legal risk curtailed large-scale raids, demonstrating that piracy could not endure in the absence of supportive infrastructure, administrative tolerance, or access to semi-autonomous ports. By the end of the 1720s, the Golden Age of Piracy had entered its final phase, defined by small, isolated crews operating under constant threat of capture. Fragmentation limited the scope and effectiveness of raiding, setting the stage for comprehensive suppression by coordinated naval, legal, and colonial measures. Fragmentation accelerated state suppression, as isolated pirate groups were systematically pursued, captured, and prosecuted, marking the effective end of sustained Golden Age operations. High-profile executions reinforced state authority across Atlantic ports. As the Golden Age of Piracy waned, colonial governments and metropolitan authorities relied on public trials and executions to assert legal dominance and deter residual pirate activity. Records from admiralty courts, colonial correspondence, and contemporary pamphlets describe formal proceedings in ports such as Boston, Charleston, Port Royal, and London, where captured pirates were prosecuted under the 1717 Piracy Act. These trials were widely publicized, with sentences carried out openly, often on gallows near busy harbors, emphasizing the consequences of maritime predation and reinforcing the rule of law. The legal process followed codified procedures that distinguished piracy from other maritime offenses. Trial records indicate that defendants were charged with specific acts of seizure, murder, or assault on the high seas, with evidence drawn from witness testimonies, ship logs, and captured cargo inventories. Defense options were limited. Pirate articles or informal crew agreements were not recognized as legal justification. Sentencing consistently involved execution by hanging for convicted pirates, occasionally supplemented by confiscation of vessels and goods. Documentation from colonial authorities underscores that such measures were intended not only to punish individuals, but also to convey imperial resolve to merchant communities, colonial officials, and potential raiders. Executions served a broader social and political function as instruments of public deterrence. Contemporary accounts describe large gatherings of spectators, including local residents, merchants, and sailors, who witnessed the enforcement of justice. By rendering state authority visible in these public displays, colonial governments aimed to disrupt the residual prestige and allure of piracy. Official reports from ports in the Caribbean and North America indicate that the execution of high-profile captains, those with reputations for skill, notoriety, or previous defiance, had a measurable effect on discouraging recruitment and diminishing the operational confidence of remaining pirate crews. Interpretive insights highlight the structural significance of these proceedings. First, public trials and executions institutionalized the consequences of piracy within the legal and social order, transforming the suppression of maritime predation into a demonstrable and predictable outcome. Second, the focus on prominent figures illustrates the strategic use of symbolic enforcement to influence broader operational networks, reducing cohesion and morale among remaining pirate groups. Third, these measures reflect the integration of judicial, military, and administrative instruments, showing how enforcement operated as a systemic, multi-layered mechanism rather than as ad hoc punishment. Legal visibility was complemented by administrative and logistical measures to prevent escape or resurgence. Port authorities coordinated with naval detachments to monitor shipping lanes and coastal regions, ensuring that captured pirates could not be rescued or that raiding parties could not reconstitute themselves. Letters between governors and admiralty officials document the use of intelligence gathering, informants, and coordinated surveillance, creating an environment in which the risk of capture and prosecution became nearly absolute. This integration of legal, administrative, and military strategies contributed directly to the rapid attrition of pirate activity in the late 1720s. By the early 1730s, the combined effects of trials, executions, and public deterrence had decisively undermined the operational capacity of pirate groups. Surviving individuals either accepted pardons, reintegrated into lawful maritime labor, or were apprehended and prosecuted. Historical documentation indicates that this period marked the final phase of the Golden Age, as systematic enforcement, legal visibility, and public deterrence collectively dismantled both the economic and social structures sustaining piracy. Legal visibility contributed to the final decline, as coordinated enforcement and public deterrence eliminated the remaining operational, economic, and social infrastructure that had enabled sustained pirate activity. Strengthened navies and secure trade routes left little room for illicit operations. By the late 1720s, the systematic expansion of European naval patrols, the reinforcement of convoy systems, and the suppression of semi-autonomous pirate havens significantly reduced the operational space available to maritime raiders. Admiralty correspondence, colonial reports, and shipping records indicate that major trade routes between Europe, the Caribbean, North America, and the Indian Ocean were effectively policed, diminishing both the accessibility of targets and the profitability of raiding. The structural conditions that had allowed piracy to thrive, fragmented enforcement, semi-permanent bases, and regional instability, were largely eliminated, leaving residual pirate crews with limited options. Economic shifts also contributed to declining opportunities. The stabilization of colonial markets, increased regulation of commerce, and improved coordination between metropolitan governments and colonial administrations reduced the circulation of plunderable goods. Trial records and merchant accounts reveal that pirate crews increasingly encountered armed escorts, improved harbor defenses, and vigilant local authorities, all of which increased the risk of capture relative to potential gain. The profitability of raiding, once a central incentive for seafarers facing irregular wages and maritime unemployment, had sharply decreased in proportion to the operational hazards. Structural shifts within the broader Atlantic world further constrained piracy. Peaceful succession of imperial regimes, the consolidation of colonial governance, and the integration of formerly contested territories into regulated trade networks reduced the political and logistical uncertainties that had previously facilitated pirate activity. Archival documentation shows that former pirate-friendly ports were now operating under direct imperial oversight, with legal, military, and economic systems aligned to prevent clandestine harboring of raiders. The disappearance of tolerant or semi-autonomous hubs meant that even small, mobile crews faced logistical challenges in provisioning, repair, and trade, undermining operational sustainability. Interpretive insights underscore the systemic nature of this decline. First, the expansion and coordination of naval power demonstrate how state capacity directly shapes the operational feasibility of illicit enterprises. Second, the stabilization of economic and administrative structures illustrates the interdependence of commercial opportunity and criminal behavior. Without accessible, lucrative targets, piracy could not maintain its labor or social base. Third, the elimination of semi-autonomous harbors highlights the critical role of infrastructure and safe havens in sustaining prolonged illicit operations. Without them, pirate networks fragmented and collapsed. This period also illustrates the demographic and labor implications of structural change. Former pirate crews either reintegrated into legal maritime labor or dispersed to marginal areas with limited opportunity. Reports from port authorities indicate that many ex-pirates transitioned to merchant shipping, naval service, or colonial industries, transferring skills acquired at sea into lawful contexts. The absorption of experienced seafarers into regulated labor markets contributed to maritime stability while signaling the end of piracy as a viable economic and social system. By systematically closing operational, economic, and logistical gaps, imperial powers effectively ended the era of sustained pirate activity. The combination of strong naval presence, regulated trade, legal enforcement, and administrative oversight created an environment in which piracy was no longer a strategically or economically viable enterprise. These structural changes not only curtailed individual operations but also dissolved the social and organizational frameworks that had supported the Golden Age. The end of piracy opened the way for long-term reassessment, allowing historians, policymakers, and contemporary observers to evaluate its economic, social, and geopolitical significance within the broader Atlantic and Indian Ocean worlds. Anti-piracy measures shaped the development of modern maritime law. The systematic suppression of piracy during the early 18th century established legal precedents that influenced the codification of maritime crime and the authority of admiralty courts. The Piracy Acts of 1698 and 1717, coupled with colonial and metropolitan enforcement mechanisms, created a framework for prosecuting offenses on the high seas, defining piracy as a distinct criminal category with standardized procedures and punishments. Court records, admiralty correspondence, and contemporary legal treatises demonstrate how these measures formalized jurisdictional principles, clarified evidentiary requirements, and integrated colonial courts into metropolitan legal systems, laying the foundation for modern concepts of international maritime law. The operational requirements of anti-piracy campaigns also contributed to naval evolution. Sustained patrols, convoy escort systems, and coordinated interdiction operations demanded improvements in ship design, armament, and logistical organization. Admiralty logs and ship registries indicate that vessels were increasingly constructed for speed, maneuverability, and endurance, incorporating rigging, hull, and artillery innovations tailored to pursuit and engagement with small, agile pirate craft. Training programs emphasized gunnery, navigation, and boarding tactics, reflecting the operational lessons learned during the Golden Age. These adaptations enhanced naval capacity for long-range enforcement, demonstrating a direct link between pirate suppression and the professionalization of European navies. Interpretive analysis underscores the broader significance of these developments. First, the codification of piracy as a prosecutable crime illustrates the extension of state authority into previously unregulated maritime spaces, reinforcing the legal and administrative reach of empires. Second, the integration of naval innovation and operational experience highlights how practical enforcement challenges influence technological and tactical advancement, shaping the trajectory of naval warfare. Third, the institutionalization of admiralty courts and legal procedures provided a template for subsequent international frameworks addressing piracy, privateering, and maritime crime, contributing to enduring principles of law at sea. These measures also established mechanisms for international coordination. Diplomatic correspondence and trade agreements indicate that European powers increasingly shared intelligence, coordinated naval patrols, and harmonized legal standards to address transnational piracy. This early form of multilateral cooperation anticipated later efforts to create universally recognized maritime legal regimes and operational conventions, demonstrating that the suppression of piracy had consequences beyond local enforcement, influencing the evolution of global maritime governance. By the mid-18th century, anti-piracy initiatives had institutionalized both legal and operational frameworks that persisted in subsequent decades. The codification of offenses, standardization of prosecution, and development of specialized naval tactics created durable structures that informed the governance of maritime commerce, naval strategy, and international law. These outcomes illustrate the long-term impact of piracy suppression on the regulation of the seas, extending the lessons of the Golden Age into broader frameworks for maritime order and security. Legal foundations influenced public memory, as subsequent generations interpreted piracy through both historical records and cultural representations, shaping the enduring narrative of the Golden Age. Later depictions of pirates diverged significantly from 18th-century realities. While the Golden Age was characterized by structured leadership, operational pragmatism, and socio-economic incentives, subsequent literature, theater, and visual culture often emphasized sensationalized violence, romantic adventure, and exaggerated criminality. Contemporary newspapers, pamphlets, and trial accounts were frequently rewritten or dramatized in the 18th and 19th centuries, giving rise to a public imagination of piracy that prioritized narrative appeal over factual accuracy. Historical documentation indicates that while figures such as Blackbeard and Bonnie and Calico Jack did command notoriety, popular portrayals amplified their actions, creating enduring archetypes that diverged from operational and social realities. This divergence shaped cultural memory and historiography. Early 18th century trial records and colonial correspondence provide a systematic view of piracy as a complex social, economic, and legal phenomenon, emphasizing maritime skill, governance structures, and labor dynamics. In contrast, fictionalized accounts and illustrated broadsides presented pirates as lawless individuals motivated solely by greed or personal adventure. This distinction illustrates how popular representation often obscured the structural and systemic factors that enabled piracy, including labor displacement, naval limitations, and economic opportunity, in favor of dramatic storytelling suitable for public consumption. Interpretive analysis highlights the implications of these representations. First, the romanticization of pirates obscured the organized and quasi-institutional nature of pirate communities, leading to a simplified understanding of their internal governance, cooperative labor practices, and interaction with colonial economies. Second, cultural depictions influenced subsequent historiography, encouraging a focus on individual notoriety rather than structural causes, which required careful archival and analytical correction by modern historians. Third, these representations shaped collective memory in both Europe and the Americas, influencing perceptions of maritime labor, imperial authority, and social mobility, while also inspiring enduring motifs in literature and film. Evidence suggests that popular representations were also tied to broader social and political agendas. Broadsides and serialized narratives often reflected contemporary anxieties regarding commerce, law enforcement, and imperial authority, portraying pirates as cautionary figures whose suppression validated the expansion of state power. Literary analysis indicates that dramatization emphasized moral lessons, individual heroism, or the consequences of transgression, often reinforcing social hierarchies and colonial governance ideals. These narrative frameworks contributed to the institutionalization of piracy as both a historical and moral category, mediating the way subsequent generations interpreted Atlantic and global maritime history. The persistence of these portrayals underscores the interplay between historical fact and cultural memory. Archival records, when contrasted with literary and visual depictions, reveal the divergence between empirical realities and popular imagination, highlighting the need for careful historiographical scrutiny. Scholars emphasize that understanding the social, economic, and operational structures of Golden Age piracy requires disentangling these layers of representation, restoring attention to maritime law, labor conditions, and geopolitical context. By shaping public perception and historiographical frameworks, popular depictions of pirates contributed to the enduring mythology of the Golden Age, even as empirical study reconstructed its operational, legal, and social dimensions. These reinterpretations influenced not only cultural memory but also the broader narrative of Atlantic history, framing piracy as a symbol of both challenge to authority and maritime enterprise. These reinterpretations shaped broader Atlantic history narratives, providing context for evaluating the economic, legal, and social consequences of piracy within imperial and transoceanic frameworks. Piracy played a measurable role in the economic and political evolution of the Atlantic world. During the Golden Age, pirate activity intersected directly with transatlantic trade, colonial economies, and the governance structures of European empires. Archival evidence, including shipping logs, admiralty reports, and merchant correspondence, demonstrates that pirate raids influenced the routing of goods, the development of convoy systems, and the allocation of naval resources. By targeting high-value shipments, pirates forced states and merchants to adapt, introducing innovations in naval coordination, convoy protection, and port security that had lasting effects on maritime commerce. Economic analysis highlights the structural impact of piracy on trade networks. Looted cargoes, while illicit, circulated through colonial and metropolitan markets, integrating with legitimate commerce through informal networks of fencing, trade, and barter. Archaeological findings and port records reveal that even marginal pirate activity could disrupt commodity flows, affect regional prices, and necessitate investment in defensive infrastructure. These interventions demonstrate that piracy functioned as a regulatory pressure on trade, compelling states and private actors to develop systems capable of sustaining long-distance, high-value maritime exchange under threat. Piracy also influenced the political and administrative evolution of the Atlantic world. Colonial governors, metropolitan authorities, and naval administrators were compelled to create coordinated, multi-regional enforcement strategies to suppress raiding. Correspondence between admiralty offices and colonial officials illustrates the negotiation of authority, allocation of military assets, and integration of legal frameworks across empires. This necessitated the development of administrative capacities, standardized laws, and trans-imperial cooperation, providing a template for broader governance of maritime spaces and demonstrating the capacity of state institutions to respond to decentralized, transnational challenges. Interpretive insights further underscore the systemic significance of piracy. First, the economic disruptions caused by pirate activity accelerated the professionalization of naval and commercial operations, linking operational experience with institutional development. Second, piracy functioned as a catalyst for administrative innovation, compelling states to extend legal, military, and bureaucratic authority into previously contested or loosely regulated maritime zones. Third, the integration of pirate activity into wider Atlantic trade networks illustrates how illicit and legitimate economies were intertwined, providing a nuanced understanding of early modern economic globalization. Finally, the legacy of piracy extends beyond immediate operational and economic consequences. The structural pressures imposed by pirate activity shaped perceptions of maritime risk, informed colonial and metropolitan policy, and influenced the spatial organization of trade and settlement. Historical analyses demonstrate that the Golden Age of Piracy contributed to the evolution of maritime governance, the consolidation of naval power, and the refinement of transatlantic economic systems, embedding piracy within the broader trajectory of Atlantic world development. By disrupting trade, prompting legal reform, and driving administrative and naval innovation, piracy left an indelible mark on the Atlantic world. Its influence persisted in the economic, political, and institutional structures that defined the 18th century maritime system, illustrating the complex interplay between illicit activity and the evolution of global commerce. If you found this exploration of the Golden Age of Piracy illuminating, consider subscribing to our channel for more in-depth, research-driven historical documentaries. Each video offers carefully sourced, chronologically precise narratives that examine the forces shaping civilizations, empires, and global trade. Enable notifications to follow our series as we trace the rise and fall of maritime powers, the evolution of legal and economic systems, and the enduring legacies of human history. For those who want to dive deeper, explore our linked resources and references in the description for access to primary sources, scholarly analyses, and archival materials.